Hey there and welcome back. If the day has finally loosened its hold on you and the room has gone quiet and there is nothing left that anyone needs from you tonight, then you have come to the right place because we are going somewhere far away and long ago, somewhere candlelit and gentle, and I would like to take you there slowly. Tonight we are going to Saxony, to a court in the heart of the German lands 500 years ago, to meet a woman who was once called the most beautiful in all of Germany, and whose face still looks out at us from paintings hung in galleries around the world. But it is not really her beauty I want to tell you about. It is her heart. Because this is underneath everything, a love story, one of the truest and steadiest I know, and it ends in a way you will not expect, with a wife who defended a whole city with the emperor himself at the gates, and then waited 5 long years for the man she loved to come home. Before we go in, let me say that if you would like to stay a while, in this world and in others like it, you are very welcome to come along for the next evening too, and it will find you here when you would like it. And if the mood ever takes you to leave a few words before you drift off, to say where in the world you are listening from and what the hour is where you are, I do love reading them later, whatever the time happens to be on your side of the earth. And there is a real pleasure in imagining all of you out there in the dark, in so many different places, all making your way towards sleep together. That is a lovely thought to hold as we begin. Now, let us leave all of that behind and step back through 5 centuries into a place of candlelight and cold stone and painted faces. Picture this. It is a winter evening in the year 1527, and we are in the town of Torgau, on the banks of the river Elbe, in the Electorate of Saxony. Snow is falling, softly, into the dark water and onto the steep tiled roofs of the town, and above the river rises a great castle, all pale stone and tall windows, glowing from within. Inside, in a long hall hung with tapestries and lit by 1,000 candles, a wedding is being celebrated, the grandest anyone here has seen, and at the centre of it, in a gown of gold-woven cloth with 3 great chains across her breast, and a wreath of flowers set at an angle on her loose fair hair, sits a girl of 15, who has just been married to the heir of Saxony. Her name is Sybille of Cleves. She has left her home far to the west, on the Rhine, and travelled into this cold eastern land to become a wife, and one day an electress, and though she cannot know it yet, she has also just married the love of her life. Come with me into that candlelit hall, and let us begin at the beginning, in the quiet green country by the Rhine where she was born. She was born on the 17th of January in the year 1512, in the city of Dusseldorf, on the Rhine in the green and prosperous country of the Lower German lands, and she was the eldest child of a duke, and from the very first she was a girl of consequence. Let me set her homeland before you, because it shaped everything she was. Her father was John, 3rd of that name, Duke of Cleves, and by marriage the ruler of a whole cluster of small rich territories that lay along that river and its tributaries, a country of water meadows and slow rivers and walled towns, of vineyards and cattle and busy market squares, of trade coming up and down the wide river from the sea. It was not a grand kingdom in the way that France or England was grand, but it was comfortable and settled and well governed, and its dukes were careful, sensible men who kept their people safe and their coffers full and stayed, as far as they could, out of the bitter quarrels of the age. Her mother was Maria, the heiress of the neighbouring lands of Jülich and Berg, and it was through her mother that much of that comfortable wealth had come, for Maria's marriage had joined those territories to Cleves and made the family, altogether, one of the more considerable powers of the German northwest. So Sybille was born into money and land and a certain quiet importance, the eldest daughter of a house on the rise. There were in time 4 children in the nursery, and they are worth knowing, because the bonds between them run all through this story. Sybille came first in 1512. Then 3 years later, a second daughter, Anne, born in 15. A name that will mean something to you if you know the story of a certain king across the sea, though we are a long way from that yet. And Anne is only a baby sister for now. Then in 1516, the longed-for son William, who would one day inherit everything and become duke in his turn. Last, a fourth child, another girl, Amalia. 3 sisters and a brother, raised together in the ducal households along the Rhine, and Sybille, the eldest of them all, the one the others looked up to. The court she grew up in had a particular flavour, and it is important because it made her the woman she became. Her father was a thoughtful man, and his court was a serious-minded place, learned, orderly, touched by the new humanist learning that was spreading through Europe just then. The movement of scholars who wanted to go back to the original texts, to read carefully, to think clearly, to reform the abuses they saw in the world. The scholar Erasmus himself was admired in that country. It was not a court of endless revelry and display like some. It was a court where books mattered, where piety mattered, where a certain gravity of manner was expected even of the children. And so Sybille's upbringing was a careful and rather sober one, in the way of well-born German girls of that time and that kind of household. She was taught, above all, to be good. She learned her faith thoroughly and seriously, the prayers and the scripture, and the duties of a Christian woman. She learned to run a household, which was no light task, for a noble household was like a little town, with its stores and its servants and its accounts, and the mistress of it had to know how to command it all. And she was schooled in the domestic arts that were thought proper for a lady of her rank, the fine needlework and the embroidery, the making of beautiful things with thread and cloth, at which the women of Cleves were expected to excel. There are 1 or 2 small human details about her girlhood that have come down to us, and I love them, because they make her real across all these centuries. She was not, it seems, taught to dance, nor to play musical instruments, for those accomplishments were regarded in the sober court of Cleves as a touch frivolous, even a little dangerous, not quite fitting for a serious Christian maiden. This will matter later, oddly, for her little sister Anne, who grew up under the same rule, and was thought, at another court far away, to be sadly lacking in the graces that other princesses had. But that is Anne's story. What we know of Sybille herself is that she loved a game of chess. Picture that, if you like, as a way into her, a fair-haired girl in a quiet room by the Rhine, bent over a chessboard in the candlelight, thinking, planning, moving her pieces with care. A patient, clever, considering sort of girl. It suits everything we know of the woman she became. For she was clever, and she was patient, and beneath the sober manners, there was a strength in her that the world had not yet had cause to see. It would take a war, and a captured husband, and 5 years of waiting to bring that strength fully out. But it was there from the beginning, formed in that grave and bookish court, in a childhood of prayer and needlework and careful games of chess, in the quiet green country by the water, where the eldest daughter of the Duke of Cleves was growing up, without yet knowing it, toward a destiny in a colder country far to the east. And she was growing up too into a great beauty, that, more than her cleverness or her patience, was what the world first noticed about her, and it was the thing that would carry her out of Cleves and into history. So let me tell you next about her sisters, and about the world of girls she came up in before that beauty was noticed and priced and sold into a marriage that turned, against every expectation, into love. Before the marriage market came for her, Sybille had a girlhood among her sisters, and I want to give you that vanished time before it was broken up, because the bond formed there, especially with the sister nearest her, lasted the whole of both their lives. There were the three of them, the sisters, with the one boy in between, and they grew up close, as children in a large household do, sharing rooms and lessons, and the long, quiet days of a court that did not go in for much excitement. Sybille was the eldest, and there is a particular place the eldest daughter holds in such a family, half-sister and half-little mother to the ones who come after. She was the one who had done everything first, who knew the way of things, whom the younger ones watched to learn how a lady behaved. And the sister 3 years below her, Anne, seems to have loved and leaned on her especially, and the two of them formed a bond in that nursery that neither distance nor marriage nor the width of the sea would ever quite break. Try to imagine their days. They rose early, for these were not idle children. There were prayers, first of all, the whole household gathering to begin the day with God, for piety was the frame around everything in that court. There were lessons of a sort, though not the lessons a boy would have, and not the schooling that princesses in gayer courts received. The girls of Cleves were not filled up with music and dancing and clever conversation in 3 languages. They were taught to read, and to know their faith deeply, and above all, they were trained in the serious womanly business of running a household, and making it beautiful and holy and well-ordered. And so much needlework. Hours and hours of it, the girls sitting together at their embroidery, their needles going in and out, making the fine worked cloths and hangings and garments that a noble house required, and that a noble lady was judged by. It sounds tedious to us, perhaps, but picture it more kindly than that. 3 sisters sitting together in the light of a window, or by the fire on a winter afternoon, their heads bent over their work, talking softly as they sewed, the older ones teaching the younger. The whole slow, companionable rhythm of women's work that has bound sisters together in every age. That was the texture of Sybille's girlhood. Quiet, industrious, close. They knew, of course, all of them, even as children, what they were for. The Duke's daughters were not raised for themselves. They were raised to be married, well and usefully, to cement alliances and extend the house's reach and standing, and every girl in such a family understood from an early age that a husband would one day be chosen for her by her father for reasons of state, and that she would leave her home and go to live in his, wherever that might be, and make the best of it. It was simply the water they swam in. Marriage was a matter of policy, arranged over their heads by grave men in council chambers, and love, if it came at all, was expected to come afterward if a girl was fortunate, and to be entirely absent if she was not. Sybille, being the eldest, would be the first to go. She must have known that her turn would come before the others, that she would be the first of the sisters to be handed to a stranger and sent away. And here is where her particular gift, or her particular danger, entered the story, because Sybille was becoming, as she moved through her girlhood into young womanhood, quite remarkably lovely, fair-haired, fine-featured, with the kind of beauty that painters would later travel to record, and poets would call the loveliest in the German lands. In a world where a daughter's looks were one of a family's chief assets, a loveliness like that was a valuable thing indeed, and it meant that Sybille would be married high to someone important, for a beauty like hers could reach further up the ladder of princes than a plainer sister's could. There is something a little sad in that, when you think about it, though the age did not think it sad at all. A girl's loveliness, which ought to be simply her own, a private possession, was in that world a kind of currency, weighed and valued and spent by others for the family's advantage. Sybille's beauty was going to buy her family a splendid connection, and it was going to carry her away, far away from these sisters and this quiet green country, into a colder and more dangerous world. But it was also, as things turned out, going to carry her toward the one great piece of good fortune of her life, though nobody arranging the match could have known that, or would have cared, for such things were not the point. As for little Anne, the next sister below her, and Amalia younger still, their turns would come in time. Annie's would come in the most spectacular and unlikely way imaginable, when a king across the sea, hunting for a fourth wife, would send a painter to Cleves to capture her face, and would marry her on the strength of it, and then, in one of history's more famous disappointments, would decide he did not care for her after all. But that lies far ahead, and it belongs to Anne. What matters here is that these two sisters, Sybille and Anne, the beauty of Saxony and the rejected Queen of England, would go on writing to each other across all the miles and all the years, two Cleves women managing two difficult, powerful, very large husbands until death parted them. The nursery bond held. It is one of the quiet, lovely threads in this story, and I will come back to it near the end. But first, the marriage market found Sybille, as everyone always knew it would, and in the autumn of 1526, when she was 14 years old, the grave men in the council chamber settled her fate, and a splendid match was made, and a girl by the Rhine was promised to a prince in the east. But before we follow her east, let me stay a little longer in the world that shaped her. Let me stay a little longer in Sybille's girlhood before the marriage carries her away, because the daily round of a well-born German girl in those years is a fascinating one, quite different from anything we know, and it helps us understand the woman she became. The first thing to grasp is how enclosed and ordered that world was. A duke's daughter did not roam freely. Her days were structured, supervised, hedged about with rules and expectations from the moment she woke to the moment she slept. She lived among women chiefly, in the female part of the household, under the eye of her mother and the older ladies, learning by watching and doing the vast complicated business of being a great lady. Her life was not her own to shape. It belonged to her house, and it was being prepared carefully, like a garment being sewn, for the use to which it would one day be put, which was marriage and the bearing of heirs and the running of some other great household far away. Within that enclosed world, the education of a girl like Sybille was of a very particular kind. It was not, as I have said, the education a boy of her rank would have received, all Latin and rhetoric and the classical authors. Nor was it even the education that princesses in some other courts received, the music and dancing and witty accomplishments that made a girl sparkle in company. The court of Cleves was too sober for that, too serious, too touched by a certain earnest piety. And so Sybille was educated, above all, in goodness and usefulness, in the things that would make her a virtuous woman and a capable mistress of a household, rather than a brilliant ornament of a court. She learned her religion thoroughly and deeply. This was the bedrock of everything, the frame around the whole of life. She learned her prayers, her catechism, the scriptures, the duties a Christian woman owed to God and to her household and to the poor. Piety was not a Sunday matter, but the very texture of daily life, woven through every hour, and a girl was judged, above all, by her devotion and her virtue. Sybille absorbed all this so thoroughly that she became, in adulthood, a model of Christian womanhood, held up by scholars as the pattern others should follow. The seeds of that were planted here, in the earnest religious upbringing of her Cleves girlhood. She learned too the practical arts of a grand lady, and these were far from trivial. To run a princely household was a genuine and demanding profession, though it was never called one. A great house was like a small town, with dozens or hundreds of servants, vast stores of food and cloth and goods, accounts to be kept, provisions to be laid in, disputes to be settled, the whole complex machinery of a large establishment to be overseen. The mistress of such a house had to know how to command it all, how to manage the servants, how to keep the accounts, how to provision the household through the seasons, how to receive guests and order feasts, and maintain the dignity of the house. Sybille learned all of this, the real skills of household management, and she learned them so well that she would one day run one of the grandest establishments in Germany with a competence that drew admiration. And she learned the domestic handicrafts, above all needlework, at which the women of her family and her country were expected to excel. Hours upon hours of embroidery and fine sewing, the making of beautiful worked cloths and hangings and garments. To us, this can sound like mere busy work, a way of keeping idle girls occupied, but it was more than that. Fine needlework was a genuine art, a source of real beauty in a world that had few, a way for a woman to create something lovely and lasting with her own hands. And it was also a discipline, a training in patience and care and sustained attention, the very qualities that would serve Sybille so well in the trials of her later life. The girl who could sit for hours at her embroidery, patient and careful and precise, was learning something that went deeper than the stitches. There is that one lovely detail I mentioned before, that she loved to play chess, and I keep returning to it because it is such a window into her. Chess is a game of patience and foresight, of thinking many moves ahead, of patient strategy and careful calculation. It is not a frivolous game, not a game of chance, but a game of the mind, of planning and endurance. That the sober, serious girl from Cleves loved it tells us something true about her nature, the same nature that would later let her hold a city with her nerve and wait 5 years for her husband, with her faith intact. She had the temperament of a chess player, patient, thoughtful, enduring, playing the long game, and it was formed here, in the quiet, ordered world of her girlhood. All of it, the piety and the household skills and the needlework and the chess, made Sybille into a particular kind of woman, and it was exactly the kind her age most admired: virtuous, capable, patient, devout, modest, the model of what a great lady should be. She was not raised to dazzle or to rebel or to shine in her own right. She was raised to be good and useful and faithful and strong in the quiet, enduring way, and she became all of those things. And when the world she had been so carefully prepared for turned out to be far harsher than anyone had planned, when war and ruin and separation came instead of the smooth, grand life she had been trained for, the very qualities of that quiet upbringing, the patience and the faith and the endurance, turned out to be exactly what she needed to survive it. Her sober girlhood was better preparation for catastrophe than a more brilliant one would have been. So that was the world that shaped her, the enclosed, ordered, pious sphere of a noble German girl, and out of it came the woman we have been following. Now let me carry her at last into her marriage, and up into the grandeur of the Saxon court, and show you the splendid establishment she was trained all her life to command. And so, in the autumn of 1526, when Sybille was 14, a marriage was arranged for her that would carry her away from the Rhine forever, and I want to tell you both the cold politics of it and the human truth underneath, because they were, as they so often were in that age, two entirely different matters. The politics first, briefly, because you should understand the board on which she was a piece. Her father, the Duke of Cleves, was an ambitious and careful man, and he was looking to raise his family's standing among the German princes. And far to the east there was a very grand connection to be made. In Saxony ruled one of the most important princely dynasties in all the German lands, for the ruler of Saxony was not merely a duke, but an elector, one of the small handful of princes who held the ancient and enormous privilege of choosing the Holy Roman Emperor himself. And to marry into the electoral house of Saxony was to marry very high indeed, into the front rank of German power. The heir to that electorate was a young man named John Frederick, then in his early 20s, the son and successor of the reigning elector. And a match was proposed between him and the lovely eldest daughter of Cleves. There had been talk years before of the young Saxon prince marrying into the imperial family itself, a sister of the emperor. But that had come to nothing, and now his family was looking elsewhere for a bride, and the beauty of Cleves was exactly the sort of splendid, well-connected, well-dowered girl a future elector might take. The two families negotiated, as they did, over the dowry and the terms, the hard bargaining that underlay every royal romance, and in September of 1526 the betrothal was formally made at a castle called Berg on the river Wupper. Sybille was promised to John Frederick of Saxony. She was 14 years old. Now, the human truth. Try to feel for a moment what this actually was for the girl at the centre of it. She was 14. She had spent her whole life in the quiet households of Cleves, among her sisters and her needlework and her games of chess. And now, in the space of a few weeks of negotiation between men she would never meet, her entire future had been decided. She was to marry a man she had never seen from a country hundreds of miles away, a colder, harder, more dangerous country than her own gentle Rhineland. She would leave her home, her mother, her sisters, everyone and everything she had ever known, and go to live among strangers, and never really come back. And she had no say in any of it, none, for that was not how the world worked, and it would not have occurred to anyone, least of all to Sybille herself, that her wishes were relevant to the matter at all. We do not know what she felt. The records of that age do not trouble much with the feelings of 14-year-old girls, but we can imagine, surely, some fear in her, some grief at the leaving that was coming, some anxious wondering about the stranger she was bound to. Would he be kind? Would he be cruel? Would he be old, or ugly, or cold? A girl in her position could hope at best for a husband who was not actively unkind, and prepare herself at worst for one who was. That was the lottery every noble bride faced, and the odds were not especially good, for these matches were made for policy, not for happiness, and whether happiness followed was very largely a matter of luck. Here is what makes Sybille's story worth telling, and I will tell you now, though we are not there yet, so that you can carry it with you through the cold parts that are coming. She won that lottery. Against all the odds, against everything the system was designed to ignore, the stranger she was given to turned out to be a good man, and more than that, a man she would come to love deeply and truly, and who would love her back with a devotion that lasted all of both their lives and survived war and captivity, and the loss of everything they owned. The cold arranged match of two teenagers on a marriage board became one of the truest love matches of the century. But nobody knew that yet. In the autumn of 1526, it was simply a transaction, a girl promised to a prince, a valuable face secured for a valuable throne. There was one more piece to the arrangement, one that has, more than anything else, kept Sybille's own likeness alive for us across 5 centuries. Because when a splendid match like this was made, when a beautiful princess was betrothed to an important prince, the moment had to be recorded, celebrated, made into an image that could be shown and admired and sent about. And the Saxon court happened to employ, as its painter, one of the most gifted and famous artists of the entire age. His name was Lucas Cranach, and he was about to make the 14-year-old Sybille of Cleves into one of the most painted, most looked at women in the history of European art. So let me take you next to the painter's studio and to the making of a beauty, because the way Sybille looked and the way her looking was captured and multiplied and sent out into the world is not a side matter in her story. It is central. Her beauty was her fortune, in the most literal sense, and the man who painted her made her, in a way, immortal. Come and meet Lucas Cranach. The reason we can still look Sybille of Cleves in the eye today, 5 centuries after she lived, is a painter named Lucas Cranach, and I want to give him a whole chapter, because his art is woven right through the course of her days from the betrothal to the grave. and because what he did for her is a strange and beautiful thing worth pausing on. Cranach was the court painter of Saxony, and he was one of the towering artists of the German Renaissance, a man of enormous output and enormous influence, who ran a busy workshop turning out portraits and altarpieces and mythological scenes by the hundred. He was court painter to the Electors of Saxony for a long stretch of his life, a trusted servant of that house, a wealthy and respected man, even the mayor of his town at one point. And because he served the Saxon court, when the Saxon heir became betrothed to the beauty of Cleves, it fell to Cranach to paint her. And so, around the time of the betrothal, when Sybille was just 14, Cranach made her portrait, or rather he made several, for such images were often produced in pairs and copies, and it is one of the loveliest things to survive from that whole world. Picture the girl he painted. She is shown as a bride in a gown of rich fabric with the Saxon pattern woven into the gold, with 3 heavy chains lying across her breast, the marks of her new status and wealth. And her hair, remarkably, is worn loose, long and fair and flowing down, in the way that a virgin bride was shown, with a little wreath of flowers set at an angle on her head, the wedding wreath, tilted, almost jaunty, giving the grave young face a touch of something tender and alive. She looks out at us, calm and composed and impossibly young, a girl on the threshold of a life she did not choose, made beautiful forever by a master's hand. Now here is what I find so striking about it, and it connects Sybille to our own age in an unexpected way. That portrait was not simply a keepsake, it was, in its way, a public image, a piece of what we would now call the management of a reputation. When 2 great houses made a match, the bride's beauty was part of the transaction, and a portrait like this, by a famous painter, broadcast that beauty, proclaimed the splendour of the union, made the girl into a symbol of the alliance. The image was sent out, shown, copied. People who would never meet Sybille in the flesh could nonetheless know her likeness, admire it, speak of the loveliness of the Saxon bride. In an age with no photographs and no newspapers, a Cranach portrait was how a princess's beauty travelled, and Sybille's travelled far, and it worked, because she really was lovely, and the loveliness came through. She became known, in her own time and ever after, as one of the great beauties of the German lands. Some later called her the Helen of Germany, after Helen of Troy, the fabled loveliest of the ancient world. Whether or not she deserved quite so grand a comparison, the fact that it was made tells you how she was regarded. Her looks were famous, and they were famous because Cranach had painted them, and painted them more than once, and would go on painting her and her kin for decades, so that we have not just the 14-year-old bride, but the woman she became, the electress in her maturity, recorded again and again by the same devoted brush. There is something poignant in being a woman whose beauty is her fortune. On the one hand, it lifted Sybille high, carried her to an electoral throne, made her admired across Europe. On the other hand, it meant that a great deal of her value, in the eyes of the world, lay in something she had done nothing to earn and could do nothing to keep, the arrangement of her features, the pure accident of her beauty. She was prized as a lovely object, as much as loved as a person, at least at first, at least by the world at large. The miracle of her particular story is that the man she was given to came to love the person, and not merely the lovely surface, and went on loving her long after the fresh young bloom of the Cranach bride had faded into the careworn dignity of a middle-aged woman who had been through a war. But that is ahead of us. For now, sit for a moment with that image, the 14-year-old girl with the loose fair hair and the tilted wreath, painted at the very start of everything, before the marriage and the children, and the faith and the war and the long waiting and the loss. She looks out at us so calmly. She does not know what is coming. She cannot see that she will be happy, truly happy, in her marriage, which was more than most women of her rank could hope for. She has no notion that she will one day stand almost alone and defend a city against an emperor, nor that she will lose everything and wait 5 years and get her love back, and then die within a month of him, the two of them worn out and reunited at the end. She is just a girl, freshly painted, on the edge of everything, and that life was about to begin in earnest, with a wedding so splendid that it became a byword for magnificence. Let me take you now to Torgau in the winter of 1527 for the marriage of Sybille of Cleves. The wedding took place at Torgau in Saxony early in the year 1527, and it was one of the most magnificent celebrations the German lands had seen, and it is where Sybille's real story, the one she is remembered for, truly began. Torgau sat on the river Elbe, and its castle was one of the grandest residences of the Saxon electors. It was here, into this splendid eastern stronghold, that the bride from the Rhine was brought, after her long journey across the German lands, from the gentle country of Cleves into the harder, colder heart of Saxony. Imagine that journey for her, weeks of travel by road and river, further and further from everything she knew, into a strange land with a strange accent and strange ways, at the end of which waited a husband she had never seen and a future she could not picture. She was 15 years old. The marriage was made a spectacle, as such marriages were, a great public assertion of the wealth and standing of the two houses being joined. There was an elaborate procession, the kind of slow, magnificent parade that these occasions demanded, the nobles and their retinues in their finest, the horses caparisoned, the whole town turned out to watch. There were the ceremonies themselves, conducted with all the solemnity the church could provide, and there was feasting, days of it, the tables groaning, the wine flowing, the halls of Hartenfels blazing with light and music, and the noise of hundreds of celebrating guests. And running through all of it, providing the decorations, the painted hangings and emblems and splendid visual settings that turned the castle into a stage, was the hand of Lucas Cranach, the court painter, whose workshop dressed the whole magnificent affair. At the centre of it was Sybille, 15 years old, in her gold-woven gown with the heavy chains and the loose fair hair and the tilted wedding wreath, the very image Cranach had painted, now made flesh and set at the heart of the greatest party of her days. She was the prize, the beauty of Cleves, married at last to the heir of Saxony, and every eye was on her. It must have been overwhelming, exhilarating, and terrifying at once, for a girl of 15 who a few weeks before had been sewing quietly with her sisters by the Rhine. The scale of it, the strangeness, the crowds, the stranger she had just been bound to for life. And the stranger? That was the real question at the heart of all the splendour, the question that all the feasting and processions could not answer, and that only time would settle. Who was he, this John Frederick of Saxony, to whom she now belonged? What kind of man had the marriage board handed her? He was at this point a young man of about 24, some years older than his 15-year-old bride. He was the heir to the electorate, not yet ruling in his own right, for his father still reigned. And he was physically a big man, and would grow bigger, for John Frederick was famous in time for his enormous size, a mountain of a man, so heavy in his later years that it was said there were few horses in all of Saxony strong enough to carry him. But he was more than his size. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely good man, warm, honest, deeply pious, serious about his faith and his duties, not cruel, not cold, not the kind of husband a bride had cause to dread. He was a man of conviction, who would become one of the foremost champions of the new religious reform sweeping through Germany, a man willing, in the end, to lose his throne rather than betray his faith. And he had, it would turn out, a deep capacity for love and loyalty, which he would pour, for the rest of his days, onto the girl from Cleves. They cannot have known one another at all on that wedding day. They were strangers, joined by their fathers for reasons of state, two young people who had been told they were now man and wife and must make a life together. That is how nearly all such marriages began, and a good many of them stayed cold and distant and dutiful to the end. Two strangers sharing a name and a bed, and little else. But not this one. This one, against all the odds, caught fire. Slowly over the months and years that followed, these two strangers became companions, and then friends, and then something rarer still, a genuinely loving married couple, bound by real affection and real trust, who would face the worst that fortune could throw at them side by side and never waver. But all of that was still to come. On the wedding day itself, they were simply two young people at the centre of a magnificent spectacle, playing the parts assigned to them, the splendid heir and his lovely foreign bride, while Saxony feasted around them and Cranach's decorations glittered on the walls. Sybille of Cleves had become Sybille of Saxony. The girl from the Rhine had arrived in her new country, and her married life had begun, and it began, as I say, better than she could have dared to hope, because the marriage turned real. But before the marriage itself, let me show you the place she came to, the splendid castle that was the stage of her new life. And then I will take you into what grew, over the years, between the two who had been wed there. I want to give you a whole chapter on the place Sybille came to as a bride, the castle of Hartenfels at Torgau, because it was one of the wonders of its age, and because it was the great stage on which the first act of her married life was played, and it is marvellous to wander through in the imagination on a quiet night. Torgau sat on the river Elbe, in the flat sandy country of Saxony, and it was one of the principal seats of the electors, a favoured residence where much of the business and splendour of the court took place. And rising above the river was the castle Hartenfels, which the electors were rebuilding, in Sybille's day, into one of the most magnificent palaces in all the German lands, a showpiece of the new Renaissance style flowing up from Italy, all pale stone and tall windows and carved ornament, a building meant to proclaim the wealth and taste and power of the House of Saxony. Let me walk you through it, as it would have been. You would approach across the flat land and see it rising ahead of you, huge and pale above the river, its long ranges of building enclosing a wide courtyard, its many windows catching the light. You would pass through the gate into that courtyard, and there you would see the marvel that made Hartenfels famous, a great spiral staircase, open to the air, winding up the face of the building in a broad stone curve. And here is the wonder of it. The staircase seemed to have no central support, to spiral up unsupported, a feat of stonemasonry so bold and so elegant that visitors came simply to marvel at it. It was called, and is still called, a masterpiece of its kind, one of the boldest architectural achievements of the age, and it stood at the heart of Sybille's Torgau, the first thing to astonish any visitor. Inside, the castle was a world of grandeur and comfort, or as much comfort as that age could contrive. There were the great halls, high-ceilinged and hung with tapestries, where the feasts and ceremonies of the court took place, lit by hundreds of candles, warmed by huge fireplaces, filled on great occasions with the noise and colour of a princely gathering. There were the private apartments, the chambers where the elector and electress lived their more intimate lives, hung with rich cloth, furnished with carved wood and precious things warmed by the beautiful tiled stoves that German craftsmen made, those tall glazed towers of ceramic that held their heat through the cold nights and were, in their way, works of art in themselves. There was a chapel for the devotions that framed every day. There were the endless service rooms, the kitchens and stores and offices, where the vast machinery of the household did its work. Picture the castle at night, in Sybille's time, in the good years before the war. The Saxon winter cold outside, the river dark below, snow perhaps falling into the black water, And inside, the warmth and the light, the candles burning, the tiled stoves glowing, the tapestries stirring faintly in the draughts, the great household settling towards sleep. The Elector and his Electress in their rich apartments, their children asleep in the nursery, the servants in their quarters. The enormous establishment quiet at last after the business of the day, held safe and warm within the pale stone walls above the frozen river. Sybille's home in the years of her fortune, the splendid castle of Hartenfels at Torgau, and she was its mistress, moving through its stately halls and quiet chambers as the lady of the house. And there is a particular poignancy in dwelling on it, knowing what we know. For all this grandeur, all this splendid stone and glowing warmth and princely comfort, was part of what would be swept away. The castle itself would stand, of course, and stands to this day, but Sybille's possession of it, her place as its mistress, her whole splendid life within its walls, would be torn from her by the war. The girl who came to Hartenfels as a radiant bride of 15, mistress of one of the finest palaces in Germany, would end her days in the reduced household at Weimar, the splendour of Torgau a memory. So when we picture her here, in the warm candlelit castle in her fortunate seasons, we are picturing the height from which she would fall, the glory that would not last. But it did last for a good while, for the 2 decades of her fortune before the fall, and those were real and happy, and she was truly the mistress of this magnificent place. Let us not let the knowledge of the ending steal the reality of the good times. For 20 years Sybille lived in splendour at Torgau and the other Saxon residences, a grand lady in a grand house, secure and admired and content. The fall was real, but so was the height, and she held it a long while. So hold Hartenfels in your mind, the pale castle above the Elbe with its impossible spiral stair, glowing in the winter dark as the home of Sybille in her time of fortune. Now let me take you into the truth of her marriage within those walls, the surprising, deeply moving thing that grew between the 2 strangers who had been wed there. Here is the heart of it, what lifts Sybilla's life out of the ordinary run of royal marriages. Match made coldly, for policy, by men who never consulted the girl at its centre, warmed into a true and tender union, and stayed one for close on 30 years, through everything. Let me tell you what we know of it, and how we know. We know it, above all, from their letters. When John Frederick was later taken prisoner and held away from her for 5 long years, the 2 wrote to each other constantly, and a good number of those letters have survived, and they show, plainly and movingly, a devoted and intimate couple, 2 souls who loved and missed and leaned on one another, who wrote not as a prince and his consort, exchanging formalities, but as a husband and a wife who were each other's dearest company on earth. Across 5 centuries, you can feel the warmth in them, the closeness, the ache of separation between a husband and wife who would far rather have been together. Historians who have read them describe a marriage of real affection and true partnership. And those letters come from late in the story, from the time of his captivity, which tells you that whatever grew between them in the early days had not faded but deepened, had lasted long enough and gone deep enough to carry them through the very worst. But it must have started somewhere, that devotion, and grown from small beginnings, as such feeling does. Picture the beginning of the marriage, 2 young people, thrown together, learning one another. She was clever and patient, and pious and lovely. He was warm and honest and devout and kind. They shared, crucially, a faith, and it was a faith that was in that very moment in the process of changing the world, the new reform that would come to be called Protestant, and they embraced it together, husband and wife, which gave their marriage a shared centre, a shared seriousness, a shared cause. They were not merely 2 people sharing a household. They were a couple who believed the same things deeply, and were building a family and a reformed Christian court around those beliefs together. That is a powerful bond, and it seems to have been present almost from the start, and he was, I think, exactly the right husband for her, in a way the marriage brokers could never have planned. John Frederick was not a glamorous man, not a dashing warrior or a subtle courtier. He was big, and getting bigger, plain-spoken, more comfortable with his books and his theologians than with the intrigues of politics, man of deep, steady convictions rather than quick brilliance. Some found him slow or stubborn, but he was loyal to the bone and honest and warm-hearted, and he cherished his wife and his children with an open devotion that was unusual in a prince of that age. For a serious-minded girl like Sybille, raised in a sober, pious court, valuing goodness over glitter, he suited her far better than some flashier man would have. They fit. Their temperaments fit, their faith fit, and out of that fitting grew a lasting devotion. We should not sentimentalize it into a fairy tale, because it was a real marriage, with the real weight of the age on it. She was expected to bear him heirs, and she did, son after son, at real risk to her life. For childbirth killed a great many women in that century, and every confinement was a brush with death. She was expected to run his household and support his rule and be, in every way, the model of a great Christian lady, and she was. It was a marriage of duties as much as of feeling, and the duties came first, always, as they did for everyone in that world. But underneath the duties, and threaded all through them, was genuine affection, genuine liking, genuine tenderness, and that is the rare and precious part, for it did not have to be there at all, and in most such marriages it was not. There is a particular quality to a bond like theirs that I want to name, because it is not the kind our own age tends to celebrate. It was not a grand passionate romance, all fire and drama. It was something steadier and, in the end, stronger. It was companionship, partnership, the deep, quiet attachment of two who have built a whole life together, who have shared a bed and a faith and a table, and the raising of children for decades, who know each other utterly, and rely on one another completely, and would be undone apart. It is the tie of long marriage, the kind that does not blaze but endures, and it is, I think, the most valuable there is, and the rarest to find in a match made by counsellors over a dowry. Sybille found it. That was her great good fortune, greater than the beauty or the throne. She was given to a stranger, and he became the one great love of her days, and she his, and it would be tested, that devotion, as few ever are, by war and defeat, and the loss of everything, and 5 years of forced separation. Most marriages are never tested like that, and we cannot know how they would bear it. Theirs was tested to the very limit, and it held completely, and that is how we know how real it was. Bond that survives 5 years of prison and comes out the other side still whole is no small matter. It is one of the strongest forces there is. But before the testing came the building, and before I show you the fullness of their fortune, let me give you the quieter beginning of it, the making of the marriage itself in the early untried years. Bond like the one I have described does not arrive all at once on a wedding day. It is assembled slowly, out of small ordinary hours, and I want to give you that assembling now, the stretch of time when the marriage was still new and untried, and a 15-year-old newcomer was learning a country that was not her own, begin with how strange and hard it must have been at first. Sybille had come from Cleves, in the west, to Saxony in the east, and though both were German lands, they were far apart and different in many ways, in speech and custom, and the feel of the place. She had left behind everything she knew, her mother, her sisters, the familiar rooms and rhythms of home, and arrived among strangers in a court whose ways she did not yet know, whose people she had never met, whose land was colder and flatter and less green than the gentle Rhineland she had grown up in. She was 15. She was married to a man she had known only a few days, and she was expected, at once, to take up the role of a great lady in this foreign place, to preside, to represent, to belong, when she must in truth have felt utterly alone. Homesickness is a real and heavy thing, and it does not spare princesses. Somewhere in those first months and years, surely, Sybille wept for home, missed her mother and her sisters, felt the ache of the exile that every foreign bride of that age had to bear. She could not go back. This was her life now, this strange Eastern court, this stranger husband, and she had to make the best of it, to build a home here among people not her own, far from everyone she had loved. That was the lot of the royal bride, to be transplanted, alone, into foreign soil, and to take root there or wither. Sybille took root, but it cannot have been easy, and we should not imagine the early years as one long romance. They were, at least at first, an adjustment, a slow, difficult settling, a homesick girl learning a new world, and in that settling the marriage grew. This is the quiet miracle, and it happened not in a single moment, but slowly, day by day, through the ordinary business of a shared life. She and John Frederick were together now, in the same house, sharing the same days, and gradually they came to know one another, as two people thrown together must. She learned his ways, his kindness, his deep seriousness, his warmth. He learned hers, her cleverness, her piety, her patience, her strength. They discovered, perhaps to the surprise of both, that they liked each other, that they suited one another, that the stranger each had been given was, against all reasonable expectation, a person they could cherish. It helped surely that they were so well matched in what mattered. Both were serious, devout, thoughtful people, more drawn to books and faith and the quiet pleasures of a settled life than to glitter and intrigue. Both took their religion deeply to heart and shared, from early on, the Reformed faith that would become the great shared cause of their marriage. Both, it seems, were warm-hearted, capable of deep affection and loyalty. They were not two glamorous strangers dazzling each other, but two serious, kind people discovering, in the daily companionship of marriage, that they had found in one another exactly the partner they needed. That is a surer foundation for devotion than any sudden passion, and it built, over the early years, into the deep abiding bond that would carry them through everything. And the children came binding them further. The birth of their first son, the heir, must have been a moment of enormous joy and relief, and a powerful new bond between them, the shared love of the child they had made. And then more children, the growing family, the nursery filling, the two of them united now not only as husband and wife, but as father and mother, partners in the raising of the next generation. Children constrain a marriage, but they can also deepen it, giving two people a shared purpose and a shared joy beyond themselves. And for Sybille and John Frederick, by every sign, the children deepened rather than strained the bond, drew them closer, made them more fully a family. So picture it, not as a fairy tale, but as something better and more real. Two strangers slowly warming toward each other. A young family taking shape in a devout and bookish court. The ordinary patient making of a shared life that would prove, when the storms came, to be founded on rock. The grand drama of Sybille's life, the war and the ruin and the waiting, lay ahead. But the part that would let her survive that drama, the deep true marriage at the centre of it, was built here, day by ordinary day, as a foreign bride found her feet, and found, unlooked for, the love of her life. By the time she rose to be electress then, she was no longer the homesick foreign girl, but a settled wife, secure in her marriage, mistress of her court, mother of her sons. At home at last in the country she had come to as a frightened stranger. She had made the great adjustment, built the deep love, put down her roots, and on that foundation she would build the years of her fortune, and from that foundation she would face, when it came, the ruin of everything. Now let me take you into those good years, and show you Sybille as Electress of Saxony in the fullness of her fortune before the storm. In the year 1532, when Sybille was 20, her father-in-law died, and John Frederick became Elector of Saxony, and Sybille became the Electress, and they rose to the very summit of their world. Let me explain gently what that meant, because the title of Elector is not one we use anymore, and it carried an enormous weight. The old German lands were not a single country, but a loose patchwork of hundreds of territories, great and small, dukedoms and counties and free cities and bishoprics, all gathered under the umbrella of the Holy Roman Empire, and at the head of the vast structure stood the emperor. But the emperor was not simply born to his throne, he was chosen, elected by a tiny and immensely powerful group of princes, 7 of them, called the electors, whose ancient privilege it was to select the man who would rule over all the German lands. To be an elector was to be one of the 7 most important secular figures in the entire empire, a maker of emperors, a prince of the first rank, and John Frederick was now one of them, and Sybille was his consort, the Electress of Saxony. So the girl from Cleves had risen about as high as a woman not born to a crown could rise. She was one of the foremost ladies of the German lands, mistress of a rich and powerful electorate, wife to a maker of emperors. And she filled the role, by every account, superbly, for she had been raised precisely to be the mistress of a large household and the model of a Christian lady. And now she had the largest household and the grandest stage on which to be exactly that. Picture her court in this fortunate season, the settled, prosperous years before the storm. The Saxon electors held several splendid residences, the castle at Torgau where she had been married, and above all the town of Wittenberg, which was the heart of their lands, and, as we shall see, the very cradle of the religious revolution then remaking Europe. Sybille moved between these places at the head of a large and busy household, a small court of her own within her husband's greater one, with her ladies and her servants and her officers, her wardrobe and her jewels and her chapel. She oversaw it all with the competence she had been trained for since girlhood, the running of a princely establishment being a genuine and demanding job, a matter of accounts and provisioning and the management of many people, at which she excelled. And there was one particular treasure of that court that I must mention, because it tells you what kind of people she and her husband were. They built, at their court, one of the largest libraries in all of Germany. Think about that for a moment. In an age when books were still rare and precious and expensive, when many a nobleman owned barely a handful, the Elector and Electress of Saxony gathered one of the greatest collections of books in the German lands. This was not a court of mere display and revelry. It was a court of learning, of reading, of serious thought, presided over by a bookish, devout prince and his clever, pious wife, a place where the life of the mind and the life of the soul were taken seriously. That library is a window into their marriage and their values, 2 people who loved books and ideas and their faith building a court around those loves. Sybille's particular reputation in these years was as the very model of a Christian household mistress, and it was so marked that a leading reformer of the day, a theologian named Justus Menius, dedicated a whole book to her, a book precisely about the proper Christian ordering of a household, holding her up as the ideal to which such a lady should aspire. Imagine being so admired for your management of your home and your household and your Christian example that a famous scholar writes a book in your honour about exactly that. It tells you how she was seen, this serious, capable, devout electress, running her great establishment with grace and piety, a woman other women were told to imitate. There is something quietly admirable in all this that our own age might overlook. We tend to celebrate the dramatic and the rebellious, the women who broke rules and made scandals. Sybille did none of that. She was, by the standards of her time, an entirely exemplary woman, dutiful, pious, competent, devoted, filling her allotted role about as well as it could be filled. And yet there is real substance in that true strength and rare skill, for it is no small matter to run a great court, to raise a family, to be the steady moral and domestic centre of a princely house, to be so good at all of it, that scholars hold you up as the pattern of your kind. Her greatness, if we can call it that, was a greatness of steadiness and goodness and quiet competence, not of drama, and it would show its true depth only when the drama finally came and she met it without flinching. For now, though, this was the settled, prosperous season before the storm, everything still ahead of her. But before the children, let me show you what her days as electress actually consisted of, the work and texture of the role, for it is more demanding than the grand words suggest. So what did a day at the head of that court actually involve? It is easy to say the words grand lady without any sense of what they meant in practice, and the truth of it is more demanding and more interesting than the phrase suggests. Being the consort of a mighty prince was, whatever else it was, a job, and a hard one, though no one would have called it that. It was not a life of idle luxury, of lying about being waited on. It was a life of constant work, of responsibility, of the management of an enormous and complicated establishment, and Sybille, by every account, did that work superbly. Start with the sheer scale of the household she ran. A princely court was not a family home with a few servants. It was a small institution, employing dozens, even hundreds of people, from the high officers of the household down to the lowest kitchen boys and stable hands. There were the ladies who attended the electress, and the gentlemen who served the elector, and the stewards and chamberlains and secretaries who ran the administration, and the cooks and bakers and brewers who fed the multitude, and the grooms and huntsmen who kept the horses and the hunt, and the laundresses and seamstresses and countless others. All of these people had to be organised, directed, paid, fed, housed, and kept in order, and a large part of that fell within the electress's sphere, the management of her own household and its many members. Then there was the provisioning, the feeding of this multitude, which was a huge undertaking in an age with no shops to run to, and no way to preserve food but salting and drying and the cellar. Great stores had to be laid in against the seasons, the harvest brought in, the meat salted for winter, the wine and beer laid down, the whole vast commissariat of a princely household planned and managed so that hundreds of mouths could be fed through the year. The mistress of the house oversaw much of this, the ordering and the storing and the accounting, a task of real complexity requiring real skill, and there were the accounts, the money. A princely household spent enormous sums, and someone had to keep track of it all, the incomings and outgoings, the wages and the purchases and the debts. This too was part of a grand lady's competence, the keeping of the household books, the watching of the expenditure, the management of a budget that would run a small town. Sybille, raised from girlhood in exactly these skills, was thoroughly capable of it, and her court was by all accounts well and prudently run. Then there was the representation, the public face of the role. A great lady was on display, always an embodiment of her husband's dignity and her family's standing. She had to receive visitors, entertain guests, preside over feasts and ceremonies, appear in the finery her rank demanded, conduct herself always with the grace and dignity expected of an electress. This was work too, the work of representation, of being always the great lady in public, of upholding the honour of the house through her own bearing and hospitality. And Sybille, beautiful, dignified, gracious, was superb at it, the very picture of what a great consort should be. And underneath and around all of this was the religious and moral leadership of the household, which mattered enormously in that pious age and in that particularly devout court. The mistress of the house set its spiritual tone, oversaw its devotions, embodied the Christian virtues the whole establishment was meant to reflect. This was central to how Sybille was seen, so central that the reformer Mennius wrote a whole book holding her up as the model of the Christian ordering of a household. She was not just an administrator and a hostess. She was the moral and spiritual heart of her court, the pattern of the virtues it was meant to embody, and this too was part of her work and her role. Put it all together, and you see that being the electress was a genuine and demanding profession, requiring administration, management, accounting, provisioning, representation, and moral leadership, the running of an institution and the embodiment of an ideal, all at once. It was not idleness. It was hard, skilled, constant work, and Sybille did it so well that she became the admired model of her kind. We should honour that, this quiet competence, this mastery of a difficult role, even though it won her no fame in the way that battles and conquests won men fame. She was, in her sphere, as accomplished and as capable as any celebrated statesman in his and her sphere. The running of a great household and the shaping of its moral life was in its own way just as real and just as demanding. And here is the point that connects it all to what came after. The very skills that made Sybille a superb electress in her fortunate seasons, the management, the steadiness, the competence, the ability to organize and direct and hold things together, were exactly the skills she would draw on when the war came and she had to hold a city and a shattered family through catastrophe. The competence was not separate from the courage. It was its foundation. The woman who could run one of the grandest households in Germany could also, when she had to, run the defense of a city and the survival of a family through 5 years of ruin. The quiet professional mastery of the good times became the steel of the bad ones, so do not think of her time as electress as mere prologue to the drama. It was the training that made the drama survivable. But first, the children. For Sybille the mother is as important as Sybille the electress, and her sons were the future she was building everything for. Sybille bore her husband 4 sons, 3 of whom lived to grow up, and motherhood was the chief work of her middle years, and I want to give her children their chapter, because they were what everything else was for. The first came early in the marriage, a son named for his father, John Frederick, born at Torgau. In a dynastic marriage, the first duty, the overwhelming duty, was to produce a male heir, a son to carry on the line and inherit the electorate, and Sybille did it. And the relief and joy of it in that house must have been enormous. An heir secured the future. An heir justified the whole match. And she went on to give him more, a second son, and after a gap, a third, and then a fourth, so that the nursery at the Saxon court filled up with boys, the promise of the dynasty's continuance. I must tell you plainly and briefly, as is right, that not all of them lived. One of the little boys, born some years into the marriage, died as an infant, in the way that so many children did in that century, when even the children of the richest and most powerful families were carried off with terrible regularity by the illnesses that no physician of the age could cure. He survived only a matter of days. I will not dwell on it, for it is a grief that needs no dwelling, only acknowledging that Sybille, like almost every mother of her time, knew the loss of a child, held a baby who did not live, and carried that particular sorrow, as mothers do, quietly for the rest of her days. 3 of her sons, though, lived and thrived and grew to be men, and it is a testament to something, her care or her fortune or both, that 3 of 4 survived, when so many mothers buried far more than they raised. The sons who lived were John Frederick the Younger, who would be called John Frederick II, and John William, and another John Frederick the youngest, called the Third, for it was the custom to reuse the beloved names of the family, which can make the genealogies confusing, but tells you how these families thought of themselves as a line, a continuity, the same names recurring down the generations like a held note. These boys grew up in the Reformed faith their parents had embraced, in the bookish pious court their parents had built, princes of Saxony, raised to inherit and to rule. And what kind of mother was Sybille to them? We do not have the intimate detail we would have for a modern woman, the letters and diaries and photographs that let us into a private life. But we can say some things with confidence. She was, we know, a devout and serious woman who would have raised her sons in that same devotion and seriousness, drilling them in their faith, their duties, their learning. She was the mistress of a court famous for its piety and its books, and her children grew up in that atmosphere, shaped by it. And she was, all the evidence of her marriage suggests, a warm and loving person, not a cold one, capable of deep and lasting affection. And there is every reason to think that warmth reached her children as it reached her husband. But here is what tells you most about Sybille as a mother, and it is what lifts her from an ordinary devoted parent into something more, something quietly heroic. When the crisis of her days came, when the war broke over Saxony, and her husband was carried off to prison, and everything was in danger, the cause Sybille fought for, the one she stood almost alone to protect, was her sons. It was to save her sons, and their inheritance, and the town they lived in, that she did the bravest thing she ever did. And it was to save his wife and his sons that her husband, in his turn, gave up his throne. The children were the centre of gravity of the whole family, the thing both parents would sacrifice anything to protect. And when the test came, that is exactly what they did. A mother is shown most truly not in the easy years, but in the moment of danger. And in her moment of danger, Sybille's first thought, her governing thought, was her boys. So hold the sons in your mind as we move toward the storm, because they are the reason for everything that follows. When Sybille defends a city, it is for them. When her husband surrenders his electorate, it is for them. The whole terrible bargain of the war, the loss of the throne to keep the family alive, was made for these boys, so that the line would continue and the children would be safe, even at the cost of everything else. And the line did continue. Through these surviving sons, the branch of the Saxon house that Sybille and John Frederick founded went on, down the generations, long after the electorate itself had been torn away, so that in the end what they saved was what mattered most, the house, the blood, the continuance. Motherhood in that age was a matter of life and death in every sense. It was dangerous to do, for childbirth killed. It was heartbreaking to endure, for children died. And it was, for a woman like Sybille, the deepest purpose of her existence, the thing she would risk everything to protect. She gave Saxony its heirs, buried one baby with the quiet grief of her age, raised 3 sons to manhood in faith and learning, and when the storm came, put herself between her children and the danger without a moment's hesitation. That is the mother she was. Now let me show you the faith that stood at the centre of it all, the new religion that she and her husband embraced, and that would, in the end, cost them their throne. At the very centre of Sybille's marriage, her court, and eventually her tragedy, stood her faith, the new Reformed Christianity that was, in those very decades, splitting Europe apart. And I want to tell you about it as she would have lived it, not as a matter of doctrine, but as the shape of daily life, and what she and her husband loved most in the world after each other and their children. You will know the broad story, perhaps. In the year 1517, when Sybille was a small girl of 5, still at home in Cleves, a monk and professor named Martin Luther, in the Saxon town of Wittenberg, had objected publicly to certain practices of the church of his day, and from that objection had grown with astonishing speed a movement that shook all of Western Christendom to its foundations. It came to be called the Reformation, and it divided Europe into those who held to the old church under the Pope in Rome and those who embraced the new Reformed faith, and that division would fuel wars and persecutions and bloodshed for well over a century. And here is the point that matters for our story. The town where Luther lived and taught and where the whole revolution had begun, Wittenberg, was in Saxony. It was one of the chief towns of the electorate that Sybille's husband ruled. And the electors of Saxony, John Frederick's family, had been, from the very beginning, the great protectors of Luther and his movement. It was a Saxon elector who had shielded Luther when the emperor and the pope wanted him silenced, who had hidden him away in a castle for his own safety when his life was in danger. The house Sybille married into was, in a real sense, the birthplace and the shield of the whole Reformation, and Sybille and her husband embraced that faith with their whole hearts. This was not a matter of mere political convenience for them, a religious label worn for advantage. They were true believers, both of them devout and sincere, who held the Reformed faith as the deepest conviction of their lives. Her husband, John Frederick, would become the political leader of the Protestant cause in Germany, the head of the alliance of Protestant princes, so committed that he would, in the end, lose his throne and spend 5 years in prison rather than abandon it. And Sybille stood beside him in that faith, fully his equal in conviction, a devout believer to the core of her being. Consider what that faith felt like, lived day to day, in her court. It meant a certain seriousness, a certain plainness, a turning away from some of the older gaudier forms of religion towards something more inward and scriptural. It meant the Bible at the centre of things. Read now in German, in the language of the people, so that ordinary Christians could hear the word of God for themselves, a revolutionary idea at the time. Luther's own translation of the Bible into German was one of the towering achievements of the age, and it was made there, in Saxony, in Sybille's own country, under her house's protection. It meant sermons, and hymns, and family prayer, and a household ordered around the new devotion. The book that the reformer Mennius dedicated to Sybille, on the Christian ordering of a household, was precisely about this, how to run a home along Reformed Christian lines, and Sybille was held up as the model of it. And it meant, remarkably, a personal connection to the leading figures of the movement. Sybille lived in the same small orbit as Martin Luther himself. He was, in a sense, her family's client and their most famous subject, living just there in Wittenberg. She is known to have corresponded with Luther, to have exchanged letters with the very man whose defiance had started the whole revolution. Think of that. This woman, whose face we know from Cranach's paintings, sat down and wrote letters to Martin Luther, and he wrote back. She was not a bystander to the greatest religious upheaval of the age. She was inside it, at its very heart, in its birthplace, married to its chief princely champion, correspondent of its founder, raising her children in its faith, holding it as the dearest conviction of her days. I want you to feel how much this mattered, because it is the key to the tragedy that is coming. For Sybille and John Frederick, the Reformed faith was not one interest among many. It was the thing they would not give up, the hill they were prepared to die on, or at least to lose all on. When the Emperor Charles V, who held to the old church, finally moved to crush the Protestant princes of Germany by force, John Frederick did not bend. He could have kept his throne and his wealth and his ease by abandoning the reform and submitting to the old faith. He chose instead to fight for his beliefs and to lose and to go to prison and to hand over his electorate rather than betray the faith he and his wife held dear. That is how much it mattered. It mattered more than the throne itself. So when we come to the war and the defeat and the long captivity, understand that underneath it all was this, a husband and wife who loved their faith so deeply that they gave up all else in the world to keep it. It is a hard thing for our own more comfortable age to grasp, perhaps, that seriousness, that willingness to lose all for a conviction. But it was real, and it was the marrow of their marriage, and it is why the story ends the way it does. Before we reach that, though, let me show you the book at the very centre of that faith, the German Bible, for it was the heart of everything she believed and everything she would endure. I have told you that the Reformed faith was the shared centre of Sybille's marriage, but I want to give you a fuller sense of what that faith actually put at the heart of daily life, because at its very core was a book, the Bible in the German tongue. And the story of that book is one of the most extraordinary of the whole age, and Sybille lived at the very heart of it. For most of Christian history, the Bible had been a closed book to ordinary people, and even to most of the great. It existed in Latin, the language of the church and the learned, and the ordinary Christian could not read it, and often was not encouraged to try. The word of God came to the people filtered through the priest, in a language they did not understand, its direct meaning locked away behind the barrier of Latin. And one of the deepest convictions of the Reformers, of Luther above all, was that this was wrong, that the word of God should be open to every Christian in their own language, so that each soul could hear it directly, without any barrier, and know for itself what God had said. And so Luther did one of the towering deeds of the age. He translated the Bible into German, into the everyday language of the German people, so that any German who could read, or who could listen to another read aloud, could hear the scriptures directly in words they understood. It was a monumental labour, and a monumental achievement, not only for religion, but for the German language itself, for Luther's Bible helped shape the very tongue, gave the scattered German dialects a common noble form, became one of the foundation stones of German culture. And it was done there, in Saxony, in Wittenberg, under the protection of Sybille's family, poured out from the presses of the town on her doorstep, carried across the German lands to be read and heard by thousands upon thousands who had never before had the word of God in their own speech. Think of what this meant in a household like Sybille's, a devout, reformed household at the very centre of the movement. The German Bible was not a distant abstraction. It was a living presence, read aloud in the family, studied, pondered, made the centre of daily devotion. The scriptures, newly opened in the mother tongue, framed the hours of the day, the prayers, the readings, the whole rhythm of a godly home. Sybille, raised from girlhood in deep piety, and now embracing the reform with her whole heart, would have known her German Bible intimately, would have heard it and read it and lived by it, would have raised her children on it, would have found in it, especially in her years of trial, the consolation and the strength that carried her through. For this is what to understand about her faith. It was not a matter of outward observance only, of forms and ceremonies. It was inward, personal, scriptural, a direct relationship between the soul and the Word of God, unmediated, intimate. That was the heart of the reform, and it was the centre of Sybille's own devotion. When the war came and stripped away everything, when her husband was taken and her throne was lost and she faced the long years of waiting, it was to this inward faith that she turned to the God she knew directly through the scriptures, to the consolation of the Word. Her faith was not a thing that depended on cathedrals and priests and pomp, all of which could be taken away. It was a thing of the Spirit and the Word, which no army could confiscate, and it held her up when everything else fell. And there is a further beauty in it, which connects to her whole story. The Reform placed the Word of God in the hands of ordinary people, in their own language, and in doing so it dignified the inward life, the soul of the individual, over the outward show of power and ceremony. The faith that taught her to prize the Word of God above the pomp and ceremony of the old church was the same faith that let her prize her husband above the electoral throne and hold to him when the throne was lost. There is a deep consistency in that, the reformed woman who knew that the treasures that matter are inward, and who proved it with her life. So when you picture Sybille in her devotions, picture her with the German Bible, the supreme gift of her age and her movement, the Word of God newly opened in her own tongue, read in her household, treasured in her soul, her consolation and her strength. It was the centre of the faith she and her husband gave up their throne to keep, and it was the centre of the inner life that let her survive the giving up. The book that Luther made in Wittenberg, on her kin's doorstep, was, in a real sense, the foundation of all she was and all she endured. That book was made in a small Saxon town on her doorstep, so let me take you now into Wittenberg, the little place where the world was being remade, before we come at last to the storm. Let me take you now to Wittenberg, the little place in Saxony that was, in Sybille's day, quite literally the centre of a revolution that was remaking Christendom, because she dwelt beside it, and it was the beating heart of her family's lands, and it is a marvellous place to stand for a while in the imagination. It was not, to look at, grand or imposing. Wittenberg was a modest walled town on the flat sandy plain beside the Elbe, with a few thousand inhabitants, a market square, some churches, a castle at one end, and a university. By the measure of the grand cities of Europe, it was small and provincial, a quiet spot in the flat lands of eastern Germany, the kind of spot a traveller might pass through without a second glance. And yet, in these decades, it was one of the most important on earth, for it was here, from this unremarkable little town, that the ideas were pouring out that were dividing the faithful and changing history. The reason was the university. The electors of Saxony had founded a university at Wittenberg, and it was there that Martin Luther held his professorship, there that he taught and wrote and preached, there that he had first nailed up or published his famous objections to the practices of the Church, and around Luther had gathered a whole constellation of brilliant reformers and scholars, so that this small settlement on the Elbe had become the intellectual powerhouse of the entire reform movement, a place where the most consequential religious thinking of the age was being done, day after day, in the lecture halls and studies and printing houses you could walk between in a quarter of an hour. And the printing houses matter enormously, so let me linger on them, because they are part of what made Wittenberg what it was. This was the age of the printing press, still a relatively new invention, and it was the press that gave the Reformation its astonishing reach. Luther's writings, his pamphlets and sermons, and above all his German Bible, poured off the presses of Wittenberg, and were carried out across the German lands and beyond, read and argued over by thousands upon thousands of people. Ideas that in an earlier age might have stayed local and been quietly suppressed now spread like fire, because they could be printed and printed and printed again. Wittenberg was a home of printers as well as preachers, its presses clattering out the words that were shaking Christendom, and all of it was happening on the doorstep of the court where Sybille lived. And here is a lovely connection that draws it all together. The man who painted Sybille, Lucas Cranach, the court painter, also lived and worked in Wittenberg, and his workshop was one of the town's great enterprises. Cranach was not only a painter, but a printer and a businessman, and his workshop produced not just portraits, but woodcuts and illustrations, including illustrations for Luther's own works. Cranach was a close friend of Luther, painted his portrait many times, so that the face we know of Martin Luther comes largely from Cranach's brush, just as the one we know of Sybille does. Picture the smallness of that world, the closeness of it. In one modest town dwelt the reformer whose ideas were splitting Christendom, and the painter who recorded both his face and the face of the electress, and the presses that carried the new gospel out to the world, all within a few streets of one another, all under the protection of Sybille's husband. Wittenberg, then, was the ferment Sybille lived beside and helped to shelter. She would have known its streets, its churches, its university, the whole busy, earnest place given over to the making of a new kind of Christianity. She would have known Luther and Cranach and the other great men of the place, not as distant famous names but as figures in her own small world, subjects and clients and correspondents of her house. When we say she was at the heart of the Reformation, this is what we mean, concretely. She lived beside its birthplace, married to its protector, among the very people who were making it, in the small, remarkable town where the future of the Western Church was being decided. And it is this town, Wittenberg, that will stand at the centre of the storm that is coming. For when the emperor finally moved to crush the Protestant princes, it was Wittenberg that lay in danger, Wittenberg that was besieged, Wittenberg that Sybille herself would help to defend when her husband was taken and the city stood exposed. The birthplace of the Reformation became, in the war, the thing that had to be saved, and Sybille was there, holding it. So fix the little town in your mind, the flat plain, the river, the walls, the market square, the university, the presses, the whole modest world-changing place, because we are about to watch an emperor come to its gates and a woman stand up to defend it. That is where we are going next, into the gathering of the storm. For a long while the reformed princes of Germany and the Catholic emperor who ruled over them all lived in an uneasy, watchful peace, and Sybille passed those years in the shadow of a coming reckoning, a wife watching her husband walk, slowly and deliberately, toward a confrontation that might destroy them, and I want to give you that long dread before we come to the war itself. The emperor was Charles V, and he was the most powerful man in the Western world, ruler not only of the German lands but of Spain, of vast territories in Italy and the Low Countries, of a new empire across the ocean in the Americas, the greatest concentration of power Europe had seen since the days of ancient Rome. And Charles was a devout son of the old church, loyal to the Pope in Rome, and he regarded the spread of the Reformed faith through his German lands as a wound in the body of Christendom, and a challenge to his own authority that could not, in the end, be allowed to stand. For a long time he was distracted, drawn away by his many other wars, by conflicts with France, with the Turks pressing on his eastern frontiers, and while he was distracted, the new faith spread, and the Protestant princes grew stronger. But everyone knew, on both sides, that a reckoning was coming, that one day the emperor would turn his full attention to Germany and try to bring the Protestant princes to heel, and Sybille's husband stood at the very head of those princes. He and a fellow prince had bound the reformed states into a defensive league to stand together should the emperor move against their faith, and John Frederick was its foremost figure, which meant that when the storm finally broke, it would break first and hardest over him, and over Saxony, and over Sybille and her children. Imagine living inside that knowledge year after year. Sybille was not a woman who could be ignorant of it, sheltered from the politics, kept in the dark. She was the wife of the leader of the whole cause, the mistress of a court at the centre of everything, a clever, informed, serious woman, fully aware of the stakes. She knew that her husband stood at the head of a movement the most powerful monarch in the world was determined, sooner or later, to crush. She knew that his position, which had lifted them so high, also marked them out as the chief target, the first to fall if things went wrong. She lived, in other words, with a low, steady dread running under all the prosperity and happiness of her days, the knowledge that it could all be swept away, that the emperor might come, that her husband would not bend, and that ruin might follow. And her husband would not bend. That was the fixed point around which everything turned. John Frederick was a man of deep and immovable conviction, and he had decided, long since, that he would hold to his faith whatever it cost, that no threat from any emperor would make him abandon the reformed religion. It was noble, and it was brave, and it was, from one point of view, terrifying for a wife to watch, because it meant that her husband was not going to do the safe thing, the prudent thing, what would protect his family and his throne. He was going to stand on principle, and principle against the might of Charles V was a very dangerous place to stand. We do not have Sybille's private thoughts on all this, but we can imagine the complexity of them. Pride in her husband's courage and conviction, surely, for she shared his faith completely and would not have wanted him to betray it. But fear too for him, for their sons, for all they had. The particular fear of one who loves a brave and stubborn man and must watch him walk toward danger, for the sake of something he will not compromise. She could not stop him. She would not have wanted to stop him, not really, for she believed as he did, but she must have watched the storm gathering with a heavy heart, knowing what her husband was, knowing he would not turn aside, knowing what it might cost them all. And then, in the middle of the 1540s, the long-feared moment came. The emperor, his other wars settled for the time being, turned his attention at last to Germany and resolved to break the Protestant League by force. He gathered his armies, he moved against the reformed princes. The reckoning that Sybille had lived in the shadow of for so long was finally at hand, and her husband, the leader of the cause, rode out to meet it. The war that would take everything from them had begun. I am going to tell you about that war carefully, because it is not really a war story, not of the kind we are here for. The battles and the marches and the tactics are not the point. The point is a woman, left behind while her husband rode to war, who found herself with an emperor's army bearing down on her city and her children, and who rose to meet that moment with a courage that has kept her name alive for 5 centuries. So let me tell you what happened when the war came to Saxony, and what Sybille did. The war came to Saxony in the year 1546, and John Frederick rode out at the head of his forces to defend his territory and his faith, and Sybille was left behind, and everything that had been built over 20 years began with terrible speed to come apart. I will keep the soldiering brief because it is not our subject, and because Sybille was not on the battlefield. What you need to know is this. The Emperor Charles V, with all the resources of his enormous dominions behind him, moved against the League of Protestant Princes, and the war went in the end badly for the reformed side. There were manoeuvres and marches across the German country, the slow grinding business of a 16th century campaign, and for a while the outcome hung in the balance. But the emperor was patient and powerful and well supplied, and he was aided cruelly by division among the Protestants themselves, for not every reformed prince stood loyally with the League. One in particular, a kinsman of John Frederick's own house, a man named Maurice of Saxony, who held a neighbouring portion of the Saxon lands, chose to side with the emperor against his cousin in exchange for the promise of John Frederick's lands and title should he fall. It was a betrayal that would prove decisive, and it is worth remembering, because it means that part of what Sybille suffered came not from a foreign enemy alone, but from treachery within her husband's own family. While the armies manoeuvred, Sybille was at Wittenberg, the chief town of the electorate, with her children, holding the centre of her husband's lands while he was away at the war. And as the war turned against the Protestant side, the danger came closer and closer to her. The emperor's forces pushed into Saxony, and it became clear, with mounting dread, that Wittenberg itself, the birthplace of the Reformation, the heart of the electorate, the town where Sybille and her children were, was going to come under direct threat, was going to be besieged by the imperial army, perhaps stormed, perhaps sacked, perhaps burned. Try to place yourself in her position in those weeks. Her husband was away with the army, out of reach, unable to protect her. The most powerful emperor in the world was sending his forces against her city. Her children were with her, in danger. The whole edifice of their lives, the electorate, the wealth, the position, everything, was suddenly, terrifyingly at risk. And she was, in that moment, in a sense alone, the senior figure present, the one on whom the defence and the decisions and the responsibility fell. Not her husband, who was elsewhere. Her, the electress. The woman who had been raised to run a household and be a model Christian lady now found the survival of her house and her city resting on her shoulders alone. And here is where Sybille of Cleves, who had lived so far an exemplary, but not an extraordinary life, the good daughter, the good wife, the good mother, the model electress, became something more, because she did not crumble, she did not flee in panic, or collapse into helplessness, or wait passively to be rescued. She rose to the moment. With her husband away, and an emperor's army at the gates, she took up the defence of Wittenberg, and she held it, and she did it with a steadiness and a courage that astonished those around her, and that has kept her memory alive ever since. The town of Wittenberg was not helpless. It had walls, and defences, and a garrison, and the will to resist. But defences need a leader, someone to hold the nerve of the place, to make the decisions, to keep the people steady, to organise the resistance, and in the absence of the elector, that someone was his wife. Sybille took charge. She helped to organise and hearten the defence of the city. She kept the town from despair. She held it together through her own presence and resolve, in the face of the emperor's army, refusing to give up her husband's chief city without a fight, refusing to let fear rule, standing firm where a lesser person would have fled or surrendered. I find this one of the most stirring moments in her whole story, and I want to be clear about why. This was not a warrior queen who had been raised to command armies. This was someone raised to sow and pray and run a household from a sober, quiet court, who had spent her life being exemplary in the gentle domestic ways her age prized in a woman. When the ultimate test came, when the armies of the most powerful man in the world descended on her and her children with her husband far away, that quiet domestic lady turned out to have, underneath the needlework and the piety, a core of pure steel. She stood, she held her city, she protected her children, she did not break. The strength that had been formed in that grave bookish court, the patience of the girl at the chessboard, the depth that a comfortable life had never had cause to reveal, came out at last in the worst hour, and it was magnificent. But steel alone could not defeat an emperor, and the wider war was being lost. Before I tell you what happened to her husband, though, I must tell you about the man whose treachery made the ruin so much worse, the cousin within the house who sold them to the emperor. There is one figure in the tragedy of Sybille and John Frederick who deserves a chapter of his own, because his treachery was the hinge on which their ruin turned, and because the wound he dealt came not from a foreign enemy, but from within the family itself. His name was Maurice of Saxony, and he was John Frederick's own kinsman. Let me explain the tangle, as simply as I can, for it matters. The House of Saxony had, some generations before, divided into two branches, two lines of the same blood, each holding a portion of the Saxon lands. John Frederick belonged to the senior branch, the one that held the electoral title, the glittering prize. Maurice belonged to the other branch, the junior line, which held its own considerable territory, but not the electorate. And Maurice was an ambitious man, young, able, clever, and hungry, and he wanted what his cousin had, the electoral dignity, the first rank, the prize his branch of the family did not hold. When the great crisis came, when the emperor moved against the Protestant princes, Maurice saw his chance. He was himself a Protestant, in religion, and might have been expected to stand with his cousin and the reformed cause. But ambition proved stronger than faith or kinship. The emperor, needing allies within Germany, offered Maurice a bargain. "Side with me against your cousin, help me defeat the Protestant League, and when John Frederick falls, you shall have his electorate, his title, his lands." And Maurice took the bargain. He turned against his own cousin, his own kinsman, the head of his own family and the leader of his own faith, and joined the Catholic emperor in the war that would destroy him for the reward of the electoral crown. It was a betrayal on every level, a betrayal of family, for they were kinsmen of the same house, a betrayal of faith, for Maurice abandoned his fellow Protestants for advantage, a betrayal of loyalty, for he sided with the great enemy of his own people against his own cousin, and it was decisive. For the emperor's victory and John Frederick's fall owed much to Maurice's treachery, to the division he created within the Protestant ranks, to the forces he brought against his cousin. Without the betrayal from within, the reformed cause might have held. With it, it fell. And when John Frederick was defeated and captured, it was to Maurice that his electorate and his lands were handed, the traitor rewarded with the prize he had betrayed his family to win. Think of what this meant for Sybille. It was bitter enough to lose everything to the emperor, the great external enemy, the master of half the world, against whom no shame attached to defeat, but to lose it partly through the treachery of her husband's own kinsman, to see the electoral crown that had been torn from John Frederick placed on the head of the cousin who had betrayed him. That was a wound of a different and sharper kind. The ruin came not only from the foreign foe, but from within the house, from a man who should have stood with them, and instead sold them for his own advancement. There is a particular pain in betrayal by one's own, and Sybille and her husband had to swallow it, along with all the rest. And yet, in one of the strange turns that history so often takes, the treachery did not profit Maurice for long, nor did it stay simply triumphant. For Maurice, having gained his electorate by siding with the emperor, soon found the emperor a dangerous master, and within a few years he turned against Charles V in his turn, switching sides again, this time against the master he had served. And it was in the upheaval of that second turning that John Frederick was at last released from his captivity. So the very man whose betrayal had ruined John Frederick played a part, through his later treachery to the emperor, in the chain of events that set John Frederick free. History is full of such ironies, the traitor's second treason undoing something of his first. Maurice himself did not live long to enjoy his stolen electorate. He was killed in battle a few years later, still a young man, his ambition carrying him to an early grave. I tell you all this not to dwell on the politics, which are not our subject, but because the betrayal by Maurice is part of what Sybille had to endure, and because it deepens our sense of what she suffered and what she rose above. Her ruin was not clean, not simply the honourable defeat of a good cause by a mightier foe. It was tangled up with treachery, with the bitterness of betrayal by one of their own, with the sight of the family prize handed to the traitor, and through all of that added bitterness, Sybille kept her steadiness, held her city, waited for her husband, and never let the poison of it break her spirit. She had every reason for bitterness, for hatred, for despair. She rose above them, held to her faith and her love and her quiet strength, and endured. That she did so, through betrayal as well as defeat, only deepens the admiration her story compels. So there is the traitor cousin, Maurice of Saxony, whose ambition helped bring Sybille's world crashing down, and who was himself, in the end, undone by his own further treachery. Remember him as the reminder that Sybille's trial was sharpened by betrayal from within, and that she bore even that with the steadiness that marked her whole life. Now let me tell you what happened to her husband, and the terrible bargain that the defeat forced upon them both, the bargain that saved Sybille and her sons and her city, and cost them everything else. I want to stay a while longer with Sybille holding Wittenberg, because it is the hinge of her whole life, the moment when the quiet, exemplary electress became the woman who defended a city against an emperor, and it deserves more than a passing mention. Set the scene fully in your mind. It is the spring of 1547. The war has turned decisively against the Protestant cause, and into Saxony comes the imperial army, and it closes in on Wittenberg. The emperor himself, Charles V, the master of half the world, is there with his forces before the city. Inside the walls are the townspeople, the garrison and the electress with her children, and the elector is not there, for he is away with what remains of his army, soon to meet his fate on the battlefield. So the city, in its hour of greatest peril, with the most powerful monarch on earth at its gates, looks for leadership not to its absent lord but to his wife, and she gave it. This is what to hold on to. Sybille did not merely endure the siege as a frightened bystander. She took an active part in the defence of the city. She helped to hold the nerve of the place, to organise its resistance, to keep the townspeople and the garrison from despair, to make the decisions that had to be made in her husband's absence. She governed, in that crisis, as the head of the house present on the ground, and she governed with courage. In the records of Saxony, in her husband's absence, she is found signing decrees, giving orders, doing the actual work of rule, holding the electorate together with her own hands while the elector was gone. This was not a symbolic or a decorative role. She was, in that terrible season, effectively the ruler of what remained, and she rose to it. Think about what that took. She had every reason to despair. Her husband was losing his war. Her city was surrounded. Her children were in danger. The most powerful man in the world wanted her family broken and her faith crushed. A weaker spirit. No one would have blamed her, might have fled with the children to some safer place, or thrown open the gates and begged for mercy, or simply collapsed under the weight of it. Sybille did none of those things. She stayed, she held, she organised. She kept her head and her nerve and her city, refusing to hand over her husband's chief town to the emperor without resistance, standing as a bulwark between the imperial army and everything she loved. There is a particular kind of courage in this that I think is worth naming, because it is not the courage of the battlefield, the hot courage of the charge, which the age celebrated in its warrior men. It is a colder, harder, more sustained courage, the courage of holding on, of not breaking, of standing firm day after day under a pressure that would crush most people, of keeping a whole community steady by the force of your own refusal to despair. It is the courage of endurance, and it is, if anything, rarer and harder than the other kind, and it was exactly the courage Sybille had. She could not have led a cavalry charge, but she could hold a city with her nerve, and she did, and it fits when you look back with everything we have seen of her. The patience of the girl at the chessboard, thinking many moves ahead, the steadiness of the well-run court, the competence that had scholars holding her up as a model, the depth of conviction of the devout Reformed Christian who believed her cause was God's cause and would not lightly abandon it. All of that, the patience and the steadiness and the competence and the faith, which had made her merely an admirable electress in the easy years, made her something close to heroic in the hard ones. The strength had been there all along, formed in girlhood, hidden by good fortune. It took an emperor at the gates to bring it fully into the light. We should not paint it as a triumph, because it was not. This is not the story of a plucky defence that drove off the emperor and saved the day. The war was lost, and no amount of courage inside Wittenberg could change the larger defeat. But that does not diminish what Sybille did. She held her city and her kin together through the worst of it, kept them from panic and collapse, governed with steadiness in a moment that would have broken many. and gave her husband away in his captivity soon after. The priceless knowledge that his wife and children were not scattered and lost, but held together, safe as they could be, by her own steady hand. That was her gift to him in his darkest hour, and it was no small one, for her husband's hour was very dark indeed. Even as Sybille held Wittenberg, the decisive blow fell on the battlefield, and John Frederick was defeated and captured, and the terrible reckoning arrived. So let me tell you now what happened to him, and about the bargain that his capture forced, the bargain that would take their throne but spare their lives, and that would bind this devoted couple into 5 long years of separation. On a spring day in 1547, at a place called Mühlberg, not far from Wittenberg, John Frederick's army was defeated by the Emperor's forces, and John Frederick himself was taken prisoner. And I will tell it with restraint, because the battle is not our subject, but the capture changed everything. He was wounded in the face during the fighting, and he was taken, and he was brought before the Emperor Charles V as a captive, the leading champion of the Protestant cause, delivered into the hands of the Catholic monarch he had defied. It was a total reversal. The proud Elector, one of the 7 makers of emperors, was now the Emperor's prisoner, at his mercy, his army broken, his cause defeated, his lands open to the victor. And the victor was not inclined to gentleness. Charles had John Frederick condemned, and for a time the sentence hanging over him was death. The leader of the reformed princes might simply be executed, made an example of, removed. Imagine the news reaching Sybille at Wittenberg. Her husband defeated, her husband captured, her husband perhaps to be put to death by the emperor. Everything she had feared through all those years of dread had come to pass, and worse. The man she loved was a prisoner under sentence of death, and she was in a besieged city with her children, and the cause was lost. And there was nothing, it seemed, that anyone could do. But something could be done, and it is here that the terrible bargain enters the story. The emperor did not, in the end, want John Frederick dead so much as he wanted him harmless, and he wanted the things John Frederick possessed, above all the electoral title and the lands that went with it, which he intended to transfer to the treacherous cousin, Maurice of Saxony, as the reward for changing sides. And John Frederick, for his part, wanted above all to save his wife and his children, and to spare Wittenberg, his chief town, still holding out under Sybille, from being stormed and sacked and destroyed. And so a bargain was struck between the captured prince and his imperial captor, a bargain we call the capitulation of Wittenberg. The terms were these, and they were bitter. John Frederick would give up the electoral dignity, the title of Elector, that ancient and glorious rank that had made his house one of the first in the empire. He would surrender the greater part of his lands, which would pass to Maurice, the cousin who had betrayed him. In exchange, his life would be spared. He would live, though, as a prisoner, and his house would be safe. Sybille and the children would not be harmed. Wittenberg would not be stormed. The town would open its gates to the emperor, but it would not be destroyed, and the people inside it, including the electress and her sons, would be spared. It was, when you strip it down, a trade of everything for the essentials, the throne for their lives, the title and the land and the glory, all the outward greatness of their house, given up in exchange for the survival of the people. John Frederick chose his wife and his children and his town over his crown, and gave up the crown to keep them, and Sybille, holding Wittenberg, was part of what was being saved, and one reason the bargain was made at all. Her defence of the city had helped bring things to the point where such a bargain was possible, where the emperor, rather than storming a defended town at some cost, could take it by agreement and get what he chiefly wanted, the title and the lands, while sparing the lives that John Frederick was so desperate to protect. There is something almost unbearably poignant in the shape of it. Two people who had risen so high, an elector and his electress, one of the leading couples of the German lands, brought so low that the best they could hope for, all they had to be grateful for, was simply to be allowed to live, stripped of everything, he a prisoner, she and the children spared but ruined. And yet, and this is what to hold on to, in that ruin the essential part was saved. They were alive. The children were alive. The family, the blood, the line would go on. They had lost the throne, but they had kept each other, or would keep one another, once the years of captivity were done. And for two people who loved each other as they did, that was, in the end, what mattered most. Better a living husband in prison than a dead one crowned. Better a ruined family together than a great one destroyed. So the war ended, for them, in defeat and capture and the loss of nearly all. The electorate was gone, passed to the traitor cousin. John Frederick was a prisoner of the emperor, carried off into a captivity that would last 5 long years. And Sybille was left behind, her city spared, her children safe, but her husband gone, her throne lost, all her days overturned, facing a long separation of waiting and hoping and holding the ruined family together, alone. Let me tell you now about that captivity and about the love that held across it, for it is, to me, the most moving part of the whole story. Before I take you into that waiting, I want to pause on what had actually been lost, because the scale of the reversal is hard to grasp, and it is against that scale that Sybille's steadiness in what followed becomes so remarkable. Consider where they had been only a little while before. John Frederick and Sybille had stood at the very summit of the German world. He was an elector, one of the 7 princes who chose the emperor himself, a rank of almost unimaginable prestige, held by his family for generations. They ruled a rich and powerful territory. They kept splendid courts, one of the finest libraries in Germany, a household admired across Europe. She was the model electress, he the champion of a great cause. They had wealth, position, security, the respect and even the awe of their world. Their sons were born to inherit an electorate. Everything about their lives spoke of permanence and greatness. And now, in the space of a single lost war, it was all gone. The electoral title, that glittering ancient rank, was stripped from them and handed to the cousin who had betrayed them. The greater part of their lands was taken away. The wealth and the power and the position, all of it, torn from their hands. Their sons would inherit no electorate now, only the diminished remnant of what had been. John Frederick, who had been a maker of emperors, was a prisoner, carried about in the emperor's train, a captive with no throne and no freedom. And Sybille, who had been one of the foremost ladies of Germany, was the wife of a fallen and imprisoned man, mistress of nothing. Her whole world collapsed around her. It is one of the most complete reversals of fortune I know of. From the height of power to ruin, in a stroke. And the temptation, in telling it, is to see only tragedy, only loss, and there was loss, terrible loss. But I want you to notice something else in it, something that is the real key to Sybille, and to the strange quiet triumph hidden inside her tragedy itself. Because when everything that could be taken away was taken away, what remained was what mattered most, and it turned out to be enough. What remained was one another. What remained was the children. What remained was the marriage, the devotion, the faith, the bond between these two people, and none of that could the emperor take, for all his armies. He could strip away the title and the lands and the wealth and the freedom. He could not touch what lay at the centre. John Frederick still loved Sybille, and Sybille still loved John Frederick, and their sons still lived, and their faith still held, and across all the miles and all the years of his captivity, that love went on, undiminished, untouchable, the one possession no defeat could confiscate. This, I think, is the deep meaning of Sybille's story. The reason it is worth an evening of your time 5 centuries later. It is a story about what cannot ever be taken from you. Everything external, all the world gives and can seize back, the rank and the riches and the power and the glory. All of it proved fragile. All of it was swept away in a single season. And what endured, what turned out to be the true treasure of her days, was not any of that. It was the love between two people, and the bond of a family, and the faith they held, the inward things, the things of the heart, which no emperor and no army could reach. She lost the electorate and kept her husband's heart, and in the end she would have told you, I am sure, that she had kept the better part. We tend to measure lives by the external things, the titles and the fortunes and worldly greatness. By that measure, Sybille's life was a tragedy, a rise to glory followed by a fall to ruin. But there is another measure, and by that measure the course of her days was something close to a triumph, for she had the one blessing that most people, however rich and grand, never find, a true and faithful love that lasted her whole life and survived the loss of everything else. The emperor took her throne. He could not take her marriage, and of the two, she knew which was worth more. So when we go now into the long waiting ahead, the 5 years of her husband's captivity, do not think of them only as a time of loss and sorrow, though there was sorrow in it. Think of them also as the season in which the true wealth of Sybille's life was tested and proved when, stripped of all the world had given her, she held fast to the one treasure it could not take and waited, faithfully, for her love to come home. Let me tell you about that long waiting and about the letters that carried a marriage across it. For 5 years, from 1547 to 1552, John Frederick was a prisoner of the emperor, kept far from home, moved about from place to place in the imperial train. And through the whole of that time Sybille waited, and held the family together, and wrote to him, and he wrote back. And it is those letters, more than anything else, that let us know how deeply these two people loved each other. Let me tell you first what the captivity was, and then what the waiting was, for they are two halves of one ordeal, his and hers, and the letters are the thread that ran between them. His captivity was not a dungeon. Exactly. He was a great prince, even a fallen one, and he was held as a noble prisoner, with a household and some dignity, not chained in a cell, but he was a prisoner all the same, his freedom gone, unable to return, kept from his wife and children, carried about wherever the emperor went, sometimes far away in distant parts of the imperial dominions. For a man of his deep domestic warmth, who loved his wife and his home and his family above all worldly things, it was a wearing, heartsick captivity, the seasons passing, his health suffering, his beloved Saxony, and his beloved Sybille always out of reach, and he bore it, by all accounts, with patience and faith, refusing even now to buy his freedom by betraying his religion, holding to his beliefs through all the long imprisonment, which is its own kind of quiet heroism, the steadiness of a man who will not break, and her waiting. Picture Sybille through that long ordeal. Her husband gone, her throne gone, her old life in ruins, and no certainty for a long time that she would ever see him again. She had to hold the diminished family together, care for the children, manage what remained of their affairs, keep hope alive in herself and in her sons, through season after season of separation, with no fixed end in sight. It is one thing to endure a sharp, sudden blow. It is another to endure the slow, grinding weight of an open-ended waiting, not knowing if it will be 1 year or 10 or forever, keeping faith and keeping going through all the slow seasons of absence. That was Sybille's ordeal, quieter than a battle, but longer, and in its way just as hard. the ordeal of the one left behind who must simply endure. And through it all they wrote to one another. This is the heart of it. What makes their love real to us across the centuries? The letters between Sybille and her captive husband survive, and they are, everyone who has read them agrees, the letters of a devoted and intimate couple, two people who loved each other deeply and missed one another terribly and drew strength across all the miles from the bond between them. They are not the stiff, formal exchanges of a prince and his consort. They are warm, close, personal, the letters of a husband and wife who were each other's dearest companions, separated against their will, reaching for each other in the only way they could, through ink and paper carried across the German lands. Think of what those letters must have meant to each of them. To John Frederick, alone in his captivity, far from home, a letter from Sybille was a piece of the life he had lost, a touch of the wife he loved, proof that she was there, holding on, waiting for him, that the family endured, that he was not forgotten or abandoned in his ruin. And to Sybille, a letter from her husband was proof that he lived, that he still loved her, that somewhere out there in the emperor's keeping the man she was waiting for was thinking of her and longing, as she longed, for the day of return. Those letters were the marriage, in that season the entirety of it, all that remained possible of it, and they kept it alive, kept the bond warm, kept both of them from despair across all the years of forced separation. And her faith sustained her too, we may be sure, for she was a devout woman, and this was an age of deep religion, and a woman like Sybille would have turned to God in her long trial, found in prayer and scripture, the strength to endure, the hope that carried her through. The same reformed faith that had cost them their throne was also, surely, the part that held her up in the losing of it, the conviction that gave meaning to the suffering, the trust that God had not abandoned them even in their ruin. She had lost the electorate for her faith. Her faith, in turn, helped her bear the loss. There is a hard consolation in that, the faith that costs you everything and then sustains you through the cost. 5 years, 5 long years of letters and waiting and holding on, in which a lesser love might have cooled, or a lesser spirit might have broken, or the long absence might have worn the bond thin until it snapped, but not theirs. Their love came through it all whole, proved by the ordeal rather than destroyed by it. And when at last the day of release came, they came back together not as strangers grown apart, but as the same devoted couple, older and poorer and worn by suffering, but still entirely in love. Let me tell you about that reunion. But first, let me set her for a moment among the other women of the Reform, her sisters in the faith, before I tell you about the sister of her own blood across the sea. Sybille was not the only remarkable woman in the world of the early Reformation, and I want to give you a chapter on the others around her, the reformed women of her time and place, because it sets her among her sisters in that movement, and shows what a particular moment it was for devout women of conviction. The Reformation, for all that it was led and fought over by men, opened certain doors for women, or at least changed the shape of women's lives in ways worth noticing. The old church had offered devout women one great path, the convent, the life of the nun, withdrawn from the world in prayer and community. The reformers closed that path, for they abolished the convents and monasteries in the lands that turned to the new faith. But in closing it, they opened another, for the Reformed faith exalted marriage and the Christian household as the sphere in which she might live out her devotion, and it made the pious wife and mother, the mistress of a godly household, into a kind of ideal, a vocation in itself. The great symbol of this was the wife of Martin Luther himself. For Luther, the runaway monk, did a shocking and wonderful thing. He married a runaway nun, a woman named Katharina von Bora, who had fled her convent, drawn by the new teachings, and who became Luther's wife and the mistress of his household in Wittenberg. And Katharina was formidable, a capable, strong-minded, hard-working woman who ran Luther's busy household, managed his affairs, kept his finances, brewed his beer, raised his children, and stood as his partner and helped meet through the storms of his extraordinary life. She was, in a sense, the model of the new reformed womanhood, the pious, capable wife at the heart of a godly home. And she lived just there in Wittenberg, in Sybille's own orbit, the wife of her family's most famous subject. Think of the world this made, in that small Saxon town and its court. Here was Sybille, the devout electress, model of the Christian household, holding up her end of a godly reformed house at the summit of society. And there, down in Wittenberg, was Katharina, the former nun, model of the same piety at a humbler level, keeping the reformer's household. Two women, one grand and one common, both embodying the same new ideal, the pious, capable Christian wife, in the same small world, in the birthplace of the Reform. And around them, other reformed women, the wives of the other reformers and scholars and princes, all of them living out this new vision of a woman's holy life, lived not in the cloister, but in the home, in marriage, in the raising of children, and the ordering of a godly household. It was in its way a serious elevation of the ordinary woman's life. The old ideal had held up the virgin and the nun as the highest form of female holiness, and had looked a little askance at the married woman, tangled up in the flesh and the world. The new faith reversed this, or nearly so, and held up the good wife and mother, the mistress of a Christian home, as a holy calling in her own right, as worthy in the eyes of God as any nun. For a woman like Sybille, this gave a real dignity and meaning to the life she led, the running of her household, the raising of her children, the ordering of her devout home. It was not a lesser thing, a mere worldly duty. It was a vocation, a way of serving God, and the book that Mennius dedicated to her said exactly that, holding up her Christian household as a model of godly living. And some of these Protestant women wielded real influence, quietly, through their households and their marriages and their patronage. A devout noblewoman could shelter reformers, fund the printing of their books, spread the new teachings through her lands, raise her children in the faith, correspond with its leaders, as Sybille corresponded with Luther. Women were not preaching from pulpits or writing the weighty theological treatises. That door stayed shut. But through the household, through marriage, through patronage and correspondence, and the raising of the next generation, they shaped the movement in ways that mattered, and Sybille was among the greatest of them, the Protestant electress at the head of the Reform's chief princely house. I dwell on this because it places Sybille in her true context, not as a lone figure, but as one of a company of remarkable women who lived out the new faith in that extraordinary moment. She was the grandest of them, married to the movement's chief protector, but she was one of a kind, a Protestant woman finding meaning and dignity, and even a certain power in the devout ordering of her life and household. And when the test came, when the war fell on the Reformed cause, these women suffered and endured alongside their men, held households and families together through the upheaval, kept the faith through defeat and persecution. Sybille holding Wittenberg was, in a sense, the Protestant woman's courage made visible, the pious, capable wife turning out to have, when it was needed, the strength to defend everything she believed in, so see her among her sisters in the faith, the devout women of that first Protestant generation, Katharina von Bora, down in Wittenberg and all the others, living out a new vision of the devout woman's life, and Sybille the greatest and grandest of them, the electress who was also, at heart, exactly what the Reform most honoured, a good and faithful Christian wife. But there was one woman closer to Sybille than any of these, closer than any reformer's wife, her own sister across the sea, and it is to her that I want to turn now. Through all of this, From the splendour of the early court to the ruin of the war and the long captivity, Sybille had a sister far away who wrote to her and loved her and shared, in her own way, the strange fate of being a Cleves woman married to an enormous difficult prince. And I promised you at the beginning that I would come back to that sisterly bond, and now is the time, because it is one of the tenderest threads in the entire story. You remember little Anne, 3 years younger, the sister nearest to Sybille in the Rhineland nursery. Anne's fate had taken her even further from home than Sybille's had, and in an even stranger direction. For Anne of Cleves became, of all things, a Queen of England, the 4th wife of the famous King Henry, chosen, like Sybille, partly on the strength of a painted portrait, sent across the sea to marry a king she had never met. And her marriage, unlike her sister's, was a disaster, though not a tragic one. The king took against her almost at once, decided he did not care for her, and the marriage was dissolved within months, and Anne, sensibly and gracefully, accepted the situation, was granted a comfortable settlement, and lived out her days in England as a wealthy and respected lady, the king's honorary sister, outliving him and all his other wives. It is one of the odder, and in its way happier stories among that king's unfortunate marriages, for Anne, alone among his wives, escaped him with her life, her wealth, and her dignity intact. But Anne's English story is not my subject tonight. What matters here is that these 2 sisters, Sybille in Saxony and Anne in England, separated by hundreds of miles and the width of the sea, married into 2 utterly different worlds, went on loving each other and writing to one another across all the years and all the distance, until death parted them. The bond formed in the Rhineland nursery, between the eldest sister and the one just below her, held fast across their whole lives, through everything that happened to each of them. Imagine what those letters must have meant. Here were 2 women who had started life together in the same quiet court by the Rhine, taught the same lessons, sewing side by side, and who had then been scattered by marriage to the far corners of the continent, into lives their childhood could never have predicted. Sybille had risen to an electoral throne and then been cast down into ruin. Anne had been made a queen and then set aside. 2 extraordinary, difficult, dramatic fates, and each sister the one person who could truly understand the other, who remembered the girl behind the great lady, who shared the same blood and the same beginnings and the same faraway family. And they had something particular in common, something that must have made their letters rueful and warm and knowing in equal measure. Both of them had been married to enormous men. Sybille's husband, John Frederick, was famously huge, so heavy in his later years that few horses could carry him, and Anne's husband, King Henry, had grown in his later life into a mountain of a man himself, vast and unwell and difficult. So here were 2 sisters who could, across the miles, share the particular trials of managing a very large and very powerful husband, could compare their strange, grand, difficult marriages, could offer each other the comfort and the understanding that only a sister who has known you all your life can give. There is something wonderfully human in that 2 great ladies of Europe, an electress and a former queen, writing to one another like the sisters they were, about their husbands and their children and their faraway home, across all the splendour and all the disaster of their public lives. We do not have the letters themselves, most of them, but we know the bond was true and lasting, that these 2 kept faith with each other across the miles and the distance. 2 Cleves girls who never stopped being sisters, however far the world carried them apart. And I find that deeply moving, because it is a reminder that underneath all the grand history, the electorates and the queenships and the wars and the divorces, these were real people, with real families, real childhoods, and sisters they loved. Sybille was not only an electress and a heroine of the Reformation, she was also Anne's big sister till the end. The two sisters died within a few years of one another, in the middle of the 1550s, their strange, grand, difficult lives drawing to a close at last, the bond between them unbroken to the finish. But we are not quite at the end yet for Sybille. And there is one more turn in her story, the turn we have been waiting for through all the long years of captivity, the turn that gives the story its bittersweet resolution. Her husband was coming home. After 5 years, the prison doors were about to open. But before that reunion, let me tell you a little more of the house she came from, the House of Cleves, and its own place in the troubles of the age. Since we have spoken of Sybille's sister across the sea, let me tell you a little more of where she came from, the family of Cleves, and what became of it. Because a person is shaped by their people, and Sybille's people had their own remarkable story running alongside hers. Her father, John, Duke of Cleves, was, as I have said, a careful and thoughtful ruler, and he did a clever thing with his daughters, for he married them into different camps of an Europe that was splitting apart over religion. Sybille he sent east to the reformed Electorate of Saxony, into the very heart of the Protestant cause. But he kept his own lands balanced between the old faith and the new, neither fully committing to the reform nor rejecting it, steering a careful middle course in a dangerous age. It was a shrewd policy, the policy of a man who wanted above all to keep his territories safe and his house secure amid the fierce quarrels of the time, and it shaped the marriages of all his children. Her mother, Maria of Jülichburg, was the heiress through whom so much of the family's wealth and land had come, and it was a serious loss to the family when she died, some years before Sybille's own great troubles came. And there was the brother, William, the only son, born after Sybille and Anne, who would inherit the whole cluster of family territories and become duke in his turn, the head of the house. William's story is worth a moment, for it touched the fate of both his famous sisters. It was William, as much as anyone, whose position drew the eye of the King of England toward the family, for when King Henry across the sea was looking for a new wife and a new alliance, the House of Cleves was attractive precisely because of its position, its lands, its careful balance between the religious camps, its usefulness as a possible ally against the great Catholic powers. And so the king's agents came to Cleves and considered the duke's unmarried daughters, and a painter was sent to capture their faces. And in the end it was Anne, Sybille's younger sister, who was chosen and sent across the sea to a marriage that would prove so brief and so strange. The whole English episode grew in part out of William's position as a useful continental ally, and it carried one Cleves sister to a throne and a swift dismissal. William himself had a difficult time of it in the years that followed. He became entangled in a dispute over one of his territories, a rich duchy that he claimed and that the emperor also claimed, and it drew him into conflict with that same mighty emperor Charles V, who would later ruin Sybille's husband. William's quarrel with the emperor went badly. He was forced, in the end, to submit, to give up his claim, to bow to the imperial power, much as his brother-in-law John Frederick would later be forced to bow, though William at least kept his lands and his title. The Cleves lands, in that generation, felt the weight of the emperor's power, as Sybille's own marriage did, the same great force pressing down on the smaller princes of Germany, forcing them to submit. So the family Sybille came from had its own share of the age's troubles, its own brushes with the mighty emperor, its own difficult navigation of an Europe torn by religion and dominated by the vast power of Charles V. Her father's careful balancing, her brother's costly quarrel, her sister's strange English marriage, and her own rise and ruin in Saxony were all threads of one family's story, the story of a middling princely family trying to make its way and secure its children in one of the most turbulent centuries Europe had known. And through it all, the bonds of kinship held, at least between the sisters. Sybille and Anne wrote to each other across the miles until death, as we have seen. The Cleves children, scattered by marriage and policy across the continent, remained, in some real sense, one people, tied by blood and memory to the western duchies where they had all begun. There is something moving in that, the way a house can be flung to the far corners of the earth, a duchess here, a queen there, a duke at home, and yet remain bound, remembered to one another, their common origin, a thread that distance could not break. I give you all this because Sybille did not spring from nowhere. She came from a particular house, with its own character and its own fate, the careful balancing house of Cleves, and she carried its marks all her life, the sober piety of its court, the seriousness, the faith, the bonds between its children. When we admire her steadiness under trial, we are admiring, in part, what those people made her. And when we think of her, alone in Saxony, holding her city and waiting for her husband, we should remember that far away in the west was the home that had formed her, and the sister who wrote to her still, and the settled country where the eldest daughter of Cleves had once been a girl with her whole strange life ahead of her. Now let me carry you on toward the reunion we have waited for through all the long captivity and the gentle close of her story. In 1552, after 5 years of captivity, John Frederick was set free at last and came home to Sybille, and the reunion of these two, worn and aged and ruined but together again, is the moment this whole telling has been reaching toward. The release came about through the shifting of the great political currents that had swept him up in the first place. The same cousin who had betrayed him, Maurice of Saxony, who had gained the electorate by siding with the emperor, later turned against that same emperor, and in the upheaval that followed, John Frederick was released from his long imprisonment. The details of that turning are a tangle of princely politics that need not detain us. What matters, the only thing that matters here, is that after that long captivity, the prison doors opened, and John Frederick was free, and he made his way home at last, to his wife. Try to imagine that meeting. 5 years they had been apart. 5 years of letters across the miles, of waiting and hoping and enduring the slow seasons, of not knowing, for much of it, whether this day would ever come at all, and now it had come. The husband and wife who had been torn apart by the war, who had held their love together across all that separation through nothing but ink and faith and memory, were in the same room again, able at last to hold one another, to look into each other's faces, to be, after everything, together. They were not the people they had been. That is part of the poignancy of it. When they had last been together, before the war, they had been at the height of their fortune, an elector and his electress, powerful and rich and secure, in the prime of their lives. Now they were older, worn by suffering, marked by all they had borne. He had endured 5 years of captivity, his health broken by it, still the huge unwieldy man, but greyer now and wearier. She had endured the same long ordeal of waiting and ruin, no longer the young beauty of the Cranach portraits, but a woman in her 40s who had held a shattered family together through the worst that fortune could send. They had lost their throne, their wealth, their position, almost everything the world had given them. They came back together not in triumph, but in reduced and chastened circumstances, a fallen prince and his faithful wife, with little left but one another, and each other was enough. That is the whole point of the story, the thing it has been saying all along. They had lost everything except the one thing that mattered, and now they had that one thing back. Fully, completely, they were together. The love that had survived the 5 years of separation was reunited with its object at last, and for a little while, in the time that remained to them, they could simply be what they had always most wanted to be, a husband and wife together, side by side, in the same place after so long apart. We do not have a detailed account of that reunion. The age did not record such private moments as we would wish, but we do not need one, for we know what it must have been. Two people who had loved one another for 25 years, who had been forced apart for 5, who had feared they might never meet again, restored to each other. Whatever words passed between them, whatever tears, whatever long embrace, the meaning of it is plain. The waiting was over, the love had held, and they were home together, at last. After everything the emperor had taken, he had not been able to keep them apart forever. In the end, they got their reunion. In the end, the love came home. At Migritpa, there is a particular sweetness in a reunion after such separation that those who have never been parted cannot fully know. The ordinary presence of the beloved, which the settled and the together take for granted, becomes, after long absence, a kind of miracle, a daily wonder. To simply be in the same room, to simply hear the voice, see the face, share the meals, and the evenings and the quiet ordinary hours. For Sybille and John Frederick, reunited after 5 years of prison and waiting, the ordinary togetherness they had lost and yearned for was given back, and it must have been unspeakably precious to them. Every ordinary hour of it, all the sweeter for having been so nearly lost forever. But here is the last turn of the story, the one that makes it bittersweet rather than simply happy, and I will not hide it from you, for it is the truth, and it has its own quiet beauty. The reunion, so long awaited, so dearly won, was not to endure. They had come back together at last, these two, after everything, and they would have only a very little time together before the end. So let me tell you about that last short season of happiness, and then about how it closed, for the two of them, almost together, as though neither could bear to be long in the world without the other. The last stretch of Sybille's story, after the reunion, was short and quiet and reduced, and yet I think it may have held, in its diminished way, a real and precious happiness, and I want to give it to you gently, because it is the calm before the close. They were together again, and that was the heart of it, but the life they returned to was a very different one from the world they had lost. The electorate was gone, held now by the cousin who had betrayed them, and it would never come back to them. Their status was diminished, their wealth reduced, their old grandeur a memory. John Frederick was no longer an elector, one of the makers of emperors, but merely a duke of a much shrunken portion of the old Saxon lands, a fallen prince living out his days in the remnant of his former greatness. They settled at Weimar, in the lands that remained to the family, and there they made their diminished home, the two of them, older and poorer and worn, but together. And I want to suggest to you that this reduced life may have suited them, in its way, better than we might expect. Think about who they were. They had never been people who lived for glitter and display. They were serious, devout, bookish people who valued their faith and their family and one another, above all the outward show of power. The grandeur they had lost had never been what they most treasured, and so, stripped of it, returned to a quieter and smaller life. They still had the things they had always most valued: their faith, which no defeat had shaken, their surviving sons, and above all each other. For a couple like them, the loss of the electorate, painful as it was, did not touch the centre of their happiness, which had never depended on the throne. Picture their days at Weimar, in that last short season, an aging couple, reunited after long separation, living quietly in their reduced household, no longer at the centre of great affairs, no longer courted and admired as they once had been, but at peace, together, in the ordinary rhythms of a shared life. Prayers and books, from the great love of learning they had always shared, the company of their sons, the deep, quiet contentment of two people who have been through the worst together, lost everything but one another, and come out the other side still bound, still loving, still glad simply to be in the same house. There is a kind of happiness in that which the young and the fortunate can scarcely imagine, the happiness of having endured, of having kept faith, of having come at last to a safe if humble harbour after a terrible storm. It was not a triumphant ending. Let us be honest about that. They did not win back their throne, did not defeat their enemies, did not recover their lost greatness. By the world's measure, their story ended in defeat, an electoral house cast down and never restored to its old height. But by another measure, the measure that counts the heart rather than the world's rewards, their ending was something close to a quiet victory. They had been tested to the utmost, and they had not broken. Their love had survived the war and the ruin and the 5 years of separation, and at the end it was still whole, and they were together, and they had their faith and their sons and each other. Most lives, however grand, do not end with that much intact at the centre. I think, too, that there is a lesson in the shape of it, if we want one, though Sybille would not have preached it, and I will not labour it. It is that what the world prizes most, the rank and the riches and the power, are the most easily lost, and that what the world takes least account of, the love between two people, the bond of a family, the faith of the heart, is what endures when all the rest is swept away. Sybille lost the electorate and kept her marriage, and in her last quiet time at Weimar, with her husband beside her, after all the long parting, I think she knew that of the two she had kept the greater portion. But the season was short, as I warned you. They had waited 5 years to be reunited, and they were not to have long together after it. Time was running out for both of them, running out almost in step, as though these two who had shared everything would share even the manner of their leaving. So let me tell you now, gently, how it ended. For Sybille and for the husband she had loved and waited for, and been restored to at the last. Their story closes as it should, with the two of them together, and almost at the same moment. Sybille of Cleves died on the 21st of February in 1554 at Weimar, aged 42, and her husband followed her within a matter of weeks, and I will tell the ending plainly and tenderly, for it is one of the gentlest and most fitting closes to any love story I know. They had been reunited for less than 2 years. After the long ordeal of his captivity, after the waiting and the letters and the faith that had held them together across the miles, they had been given back to one another, and had made their quiet diminished home at Weimar, and had lived there together in the remnant of their days. And then, in the early part of 1554, Sybille's life came to its end. She had been through so much, the rise and the ruin, the war and the waiting, the loss of nearly all, and the recovery of the one thing that mattered. She was worn, no doubt, by all of it, aged beyond her age by the sorrows she had carried, and in that February she died, quietly, at Weimar, 42 years old. I will not dwell on the manner of her death, for the records do not tell us much, and it is not the way of this story to linger over such things. She died, as people did in that age, and the details are not important. What is important is the shape of the ending, the timing of it, the way her death and her husband's fell so close together that they read across 5 centuries, like the last and truest proof of how bound these two had been. For John Frederick did not long survive her. Within weeks of Sybille's death, in the early spring that followed, he died too. The great mountain of a man, worn down by his captivity and his sorrows, followed his wife to the grave almost at once, as though, having waited so long to be reunited with her, and having had her back for so short a time, he could not bear to remain in the world without her once she was gone. Whether it was grief, or simply the failing of two bodies worn out by the same hard years, the effect is the same, and the meaning is plain. They had lived bound together, and they died bound together, within a few weeks of each other, neither outlasting the other, the two of them leaving the world almost hand in hand. There is something so right about that, so fitting a close to their particular story, that it hardly needs any words from me. Here were two people given to one another as strangers, who grew into the deepest love, who were torn apart by war and held together across 5 years by nothing but their faithfulness, who were reunited at last and given a short, sweet season together, and who then, when the end came, went almost together within weeks, as though the bond that had held them through everything would not let even death divide them for long. The girl from Cleves and the Prince of Saxony, married for 27 years, parted by an emperor for 5, and at the last parted from the world itself by only a few short weeks. If you were writing it as a story, you might think the ending too neat, too perfect. But it is simply what happened. They were buried together in the city church at Weimar, the town where they had made their last diminished home, laid side by side in death, as they had been side by side in life, the fallen Elector and his faithful Electress, together at the last, as they had always most wanted to be. And there they lie still, 5 centuries on, the two of them in the church at Weimar, their long story ended, their love, in the end, undefeated by everything that had been sent against it. That is how Sybille of Cleves left the world in the February of 1554, at 42, her husband following within weeks, the two of them buried together at Weimar. A quiet ending, an ending in reduced circumstances, far from the glittering height they had once occupied. But an ending, too, of a rare completeness, for she died having kept the thing she most valued, the love of her life beside her, or nearly so, at the very end, and having been faithful to it through everything, and having been rewarded, at the last, with a reunion and a resting place at his side. But before I tell you what she left behind, let me return one last time to the paintings, and to the strange gift of a face that outlived her by 500 years. Before we let her rest, I want to return to the paintings, to the extraordinary fact that we can still see Sybille's face, and to sit for a while with what that means, because it is a strange and moving kind of survival, and it is the reason she is not simply a name in a dusty record, but a real presence to us across 500 years. Think how few people of that distant age we can actually see. The vast majority of those who lived in the 16th century vanished without a trace of their appearance, their faces gone forever, remembered, if at all, only as names and dates. Even most of the great and powerful left behind only a stiff formal likeness or two, or nothing at all. But Sybille we can see, again and again, at different ages, in different moods, because the finest painter of her world served her house and recorded her across the decades, and a good number of those paintings survive, scattered now through the galleries and collections of the world. There is the young bride, of course, the 14-year-old with the loose fair hair and the tilted wedding wreath and the gold-woven gown, painted at the betrothal, a girl on the threshold of her life, calm and lovely and impossibly young. That image exists in more than one version, for such portraits were copied, and it is the one that fixed her fame, the beauty of Cleves, at the start of everything. And there are the later portraits too, Sybille as a grown woman, as the Electress in her prime, her features fuller and graver, the girl grown into the grand lady. Cranach and his workshop painted her across the years, so that we have not a single frozen image but a kind of sequence, the record of a countenance changing through a life. And there is something almost uncanny in looking at them, knowing what we know. We can look at the calm, lovely 14-year-old bride and know everything that is coming to her, the marriage that will become love, the throne she will rise to, the war that will take it, the city she will defend, the 5 years she will wait. The reunion, the death within weeks of her husband, all of it, the whole arc of a remarkable life, still ahead of the serene young face in the painting. She does not know, but we do, and that gap between the unknowing calm of the painted girl and our knowledge of all that awaited her gives the portraits a strange poignancy, as old photographs of people long dead can have, the smiling look with no idea of what is coming. The paintings do something else too, something important. They make her present. It is easy, with a historical figure, to let them become an abstraction, a set of facts, a name attached to events. The face changes that. When you look into Sybille's painted eyes, calm and intelligent and present, you cannot help but feel that here was a true person who really lived, who saw the world through those eyes, who felt fear and love and grief and hope, who was as vividly alive to herself as you are to yourself. The painting insists on her reality, refuses to let her become a mere abstraction, reaches across the centuries and says, "This was a person. Look at her. She was here." And there is a kind of justice in it, I think, that, of all she lost, this survived. The emperor took her throne and her lands and her wealth and her husband's freedom. He took nearly all that had been given her, but he could not touch the paintings, and it is the paintings that have outlasted all of it, so that today, when the electorate she lost is an antiquarian footnote, and the emperor who took it is a name in the history books, Sybille's lovely calm face still hangs in the galleries of Europe, looked at by people who know nothing of the Schmalkaldic War, admired simply as a beautiful image of a woman 5 centuries gone. She has outlasted her enemies. The likeness they could not take has proved more durable than the throne they seized. I find that a consoling thought, and a fitting one to hold as we come to the end. Sybille of Cleves has been dead for 5 centuries, and her electorate is gone, and her world is gone, and almost everyone who ever knew her name has been forgotten. But her image remains, calm and lovely and real, in Cranach's paintings, and through them she keeps a kind of quiet immortality, not the immortality of the conqueror carved in triumph, but the gentler immortality of a likeness preserved with love by a fine artist, a real woman still looking out at us across all the centuries from the beginning of her extraordinary life. So when you think of her after tonight, think of that calm, fair girl with the tilted wreath, or the grave, strong electress of the later years, and know that behind it was a real woman who lived one of the most testing lives of her age, and met it with a quiet, unbreakable strength. And now, having seen her one last time, let me tell you what she left behind, and how she is remembered, before we let her rest. Sybille of Cleves has been gone for 5 centuries now, and I want to tell you what she left behind, because a life like hers does not simply vanish, and pieces of her endure, in paint and in blood, and in the quiet example of how she met the worst that came to her. She left, first, her sons, and through them a line that endured. The electorate had been torn away, but the family was not extinguished, and the 3 sons who lived carried the blood and the name forward into the generations that followed. The branch of the Saxon house that Sybille and John Frederick founded went on, its dukes ruling their diminished lands, its descendants spreading through the princely families of Germany down the centuries. The thing the couple had sacrificed their throne to protect, the survival of the house, the continuance of the line, was secured, and it outlasted the loss of the crown by centuries. In that sense, the terrible bargain of the war was not a defeat at all, but a kind of victory, for they had chosen to save the essential thing, the family, over the outward thing, the throne, and the line endured while the throne would have been lost in any case. She left too her likeness, and this is no small legacy, for it is why we can know her at all. The paintings of Lucas Cranach and his workshop have carried Sybille's likeness down through 5 centuries, so that we, who could never have known her, can look into the calm, lovely face of the 14-year-old bride with her loose fair hair and her tilted wedding wreath, and the maturer face of the electress in her prime. Few people of that age are so vividly preserved for us. Most are only names in a record, faceless, lost. But Sybille we can see, thanks to the painter who served her family, and in seeing her we can feel, across all the centuries, the reality of her, a real woman who really lived and loved and suffered and endured, not an abstraction, but a person with that particular face. And she left an example which is perhaps the finest legacy of all. Sybille's life is a lesson in a certain kind of quiet strength, the strength that does not announce itself in the easy years and reveals its full depth only under pressure. Most of her days she was simply an exemplary woman, a good daughter, a good wife, a devoted mother, a capable electress, admired but not extraordinary, the model of a Christian lady. And then the storm came, and that quiet, exemplary woman turned out to have a core of steel, defended a city against an emperor, held a shattered family together through 5 years of ruin and separation, and kept faith with her husband and her God through the worst that fortune could send. She teaches us that the measure of a person is not taken in the fair weather, but in the storm, and that the truest strength is often the quiet sort, hidden in ordinary steady people until the day it is needed. She left as well a model of a certain sort of devotion, the kind our own age, with its taste for drama and passion, tends to undervalue. Hers was not a wild romance, but a deep and faithful partnership, a bond that grew from a cold arranged match into the truest union of 2 lives that survived war and ruin and 5 years of forced separation, and that ended with the 2 of them dying within weeks of each other, unable to be long parted even by death. It is a reminder that the deepest love is often not the most dramatic, that the kind that endures and holds and remains faithful through decades and disasters is worth more than any brief blaze of passion, and that such devotion, though quiet, is among the strongest forces there is. And she left the memory of her faith, kept to the end whatever it cost. She and her husband gave up their throne rather than betray their reformed religion, and held to it through captivity and ruin, and never wavered. Whatever we make of the religious quarrels of that age, and they were bitter and bloody and cost many lives, there is something to honour in a conviction held that firmly, a faith that a woman and her husband valued more than their crown, their wealth, their worldly greatness, and would not surrender for any price. That kind of conviction is rare, and it was hers. So that is what Sybille of Cleves left behind, a line that endured, a face preserved in paint, an example of quiet strength revealed in crisis, a model of faithful enduring love, and a testimony of faith kept to the end. Not the legacy of a conqueror or a queen regnant who reshaped nations, but something quieter and in its way just as valuable, the legacy of a good and strong and faithful woman who met a terrible fate with courage and came through it with her soul and her love intact. She was the beauty of Cleves, the Helen of Germany, the model electress, the defender of Wittenberg, the faithful wife who waited 5 years, but most of all she was, from first to last, a woman of unbreakable inner strength, and that is how I would have you remember her. Now let us let her rest. Now let her rest. The beauty of Cleves, the faithful electress, in the quiet church at Weimar beside the husband she loved and waited for, and was restored to at the last. For her long story is ended, and tonight we can simply let her be at peace. Let the town of Weimar settle into the dark. Let the city church stand silent under the German night, where the 2 of them lie side by side, the fallen prince and his faithful wife, together at the last, as they had always most wanted to be. Let the old stones cool, and the candles gutter and go out, and the worn, peaceful place fall still, holding the two who rest within it, their troubles all behind them now, their long ordeal over, their love in the end. Let Wittenberg sleep too, the little town on the Elbe where the world was once remade, its presses silent now in the night, its streets empty, its university dark, the remarkable place that Sybille lived beside, and once defended gone quiet under the stars. Let the great castle at Torgau sleep, where a girl of 15 was once married in a blaze of candlelight and gold, its long halls dark now, its splendour a memory, the echoes of that wedding feast 5 centuries silent. And let the quiet green country by the Rhine sleep, far to the west, where it all began, where a fair-haired girl once bent over a chessboard in a sober bookish court, and sewed beside her sisters in the light of a window, and did not yet know what was coming, the beauty and the throne and the war and the waiting and the love that would carry her through all of it. Let that gentle country sleep, and the ghost of the girl who grew up there, before the painters came, before the marriage, before any of it, when she was simply the eldest daughter of Cleves, with her whole strange, remarkable life still ahead of her. Let the woman herself be at peace. She endured so much, and kept faith through all of it, and held a city, and waited 5 years, and never let go of the one thing that mattered to her, and was rewarded, at the last, with her love beside her, and her rest at his side. She has earned her quiet now. There is nothing left for her to endure, no emperor at the gates, no husband to wait for, no throne to lose, no long parting to bear, only the still church at Weimar, and the husband beside her, and the deep peace of a story that came through everything, to a gentle close. Let her rest. She has more than earned it. The beauty of Cleves, the Helen of Germany, the defender of Wittenberg, the wife who waited, at peace at last beside her love, in the quiet, in the dark, 5 centuries and more, together and undefeated, and finally completely at rest. If this evening was a comfort to you, there is always another waiting, and you are very welcome to come along for it whenever you would like to be carried somewhere again. And if the mood takes you to leave a few words before you drift off, to say where in the world you are, and what the hour is where you are, I do love reading them later, whatever the time. Thank you for spending these hours here with me. It has been a gentle thing to share. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house. And I will see you in the next one. Good night.